Chapter 216. The surroundings were cold and quiet. Anyone would be scared to death if they were suddenly patted on the back like this. Xian's heart was in her throat. She turned around and saw a person standing behind her. It was Lu Chen, whom she had been looking for a long time. "Ah, it's you, Brother Lu?" Xian called out subconsciously. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Isn't it me? What about you? What are you doing here?" He looked around, and his eyes stopped for a moment on the abandoned house where the dead person used to live. He said to Xian, "No one usually comes here. I heard that after the person died, the house is often haunted in the middle of the night." "Ah." Xian's body trembled again, and even her face turned pale. But she soon found that Lu Chen was smiling. She immediately reacted and became angry. She hit his arm hard and said angrily, "You scared me again." Lu Chen laughed. For some reason, looking at Xian made him feel better. He smiled and said, "I heard it, but I haven't seen it." "Oh, you haven't told me why you are here." "To look for you." Xian glared at him. She gnashed her teeth in hatred and said, "Do you know how many places I've been looking for you today? Let's not talk about the Flying Goose Terrace. I've gone to the Fragrance Garden and Rock Mountain one by one, but I didn't see your shadow." Lu Chen was startled. He stopped smiling and said with some surprise, "So urgent? Why are you looking for me?" "Yes, I have something." Xian said, "I heard that you and Sister Su had a falling out. Not only did you leave with your bag, but you also asked Sister Su to cancel the nominal master-disciple relationship?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's true." Xian stamped her feet and said, "I say, why are you so stupid? Do you know what kind of person Sister Su is now? In the whole Kunlun Mountain, there are at least 99,900 odd-job disciples who are crying and begging to be her disciple. But you ran away by yourself?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Did Su Qingjun ask you to come see me?" "Bah, in your dreams." Xian looked at his disappointed face and said angrily, "Of course it's impossible. Sister Su is now the youngest Jin Dan friar in the Kunlun party. She has a bright future and is even likely to become Yuanyingzhenren. Do you think she will really value an ordinary disciple like you?" Lu Chen said, "Oh." Xian patted her forehead. It seemed that she was completely speechless because of Lu Chen's fearless look. After a while, she said, "Brother Lu, listen to my advice. Go back and apologize to Sister Su. A man should know when to yield and when to stand tall. What's there to be afraid of? Moreover, I can see that Big Sister Su has good intentions towards you. As long as you give in a little and I help you put in a few good words, you will definitely be able to make her retract her order." As she said that, she rolled her eyes again and suddenly laughed. She pulled Lu Chen and whispered, "Brother Lu, why don't you pretend again and say that you have encountered some tragic and sad thing, and shed some tears? I guarantee that Sister Su will definitely not be able to bear it and will definitely take you back." "Nonsense." Lu Chen said seriously, "A man should bleed but not shed tears. You actually want me to cry?" "Oh, I said it's just an act." Xian glared at Lu Chen, then encouraged him with a grin, Go. You can't go wrong listening to me. I'm doing this for your own good. Otherwise, when you get older in the future, without a backer or something, it will be difficult to survive in this mountain. I tell you." Lu Chen looked at Xian's face and his eyes gradually became warm. He smiled and said, "You actually think so far?" Xian grumpily said, "Everyone would think like that, okay? I say you are a little strange recently. I always feel that you are becoming more and more stupid. Maybe it's because you are getting older." Lu Chen laughed and looked at her, shaking his head and said, "If that's the case, then when I am old in the future, I will look for you to be my backer and let you raise me. Is that okay?" Xian was stunned and said in surprise, "Me? Lu Chen nodded and said, yes, aren't you also a disciple of Yuanyingzhenren? In the future, you will definitely not be bad, is that okay? This. Xin seemed to have never thought about this problem. She thought for a while and said with some distress, if you put it like that, it seems that it is okay. But Sister Sue's talent and future is much better than mine. To be honest, you should still follow her to have a future. If you really can't do it, then you can look for me. When she said the last sentence, Xin's cheeks suddenly seemed to brighten a little. She looked a little proud. She raised her head and put her hands on her hips and said, hey. Come, call me master for me to hear. Lu Chen laughed and put his hand on her head and pushed her away. He scolded with a smile, little girl, you have learned bad things. Xin took a step back and pouted her head. But very quickly she became happy again and said to Lu Chen, hey, I won't joke anymore, brother Lu. Listen to me and go talk to Sister Sue. This will really benefit your status as an odd job disciple. Lu Chen thought for a while and looked at Xin's eyes that were full of expectation. He smiled and nodded, all right, I will listen to you. But these 2 days are the sect council meeting. The mountain is busy. She is Jean Dan Friar, so she will probably be busy too. After these few days, we will go look for her together. Xin thought for a while and said, well, this is also good. Sister Sue has been really busy recently. Today she even sent her brother to Melaleuca Japonica martial ant's tea room to ask my master to help treat him. Then in a few days, I will look for you. Lu Chen smiled and said, all right, it's a deal. Xin waved to him and turned to leave. After 2 steps, she suddenly turned back and asked, oh right, brother Lu, I haven't seen Atsu recently. How is it? Lu Chen said, it's very good. It eats well and runs fast. It's so wild outside all day that it doesn't want to go home. Oh. Xin smiled and continued to walk forward. This time, after walking for about a few feet, she stopped again and shouted to Lu Chen, brother Lu, where do you live now? I can't find you. Lu Chen was startled for a moment, then smiled and said, it's okay. I will look for you when the time comes. Xin smiled and nodded, then turned and left. Seeing that Xin was getting further and further away, even her figure gradually disappeared from his sight, the smile on Lu Chen's face slowly faded. He looked up at the sky. The continuous drizzle was still falling, drenching the houses in the forest. He turned around and quietly looked at the abandoned wooden house. Then he walked forward, turned a corner in the middle, and walked into the very wide forest in the distance. Like in the past, the forest was very quiet, but this time there was a little more sound of rain beating on the leaves than usual. Walking into the forest, the rain suddenly became less heavy, but the air in the forest was very humid. It seemed that everywhere was wet, and the rain kept dripping from the branches and leaves in the high places. Lu Chen was like a ghost, moving silently in the forest. Even if he occasionally passed by the wet ground, he didn't know what method he used, but he didn't leave any footprints. He didn't know how long he walked, but he finally saw the big rock in the depths of the forest, as well as the big tree that was different from the surrounding trees. The forest was abnormally quiet, and the wet rain fell. Not only did the birds and beasts stay away, it seemed that even the insects were silent. Lu Chen's eyes slowly brightened. His gaze swept across the surrounding ground, looking at every tree, and even every piece of gravel and weed, not sparing a single strand of grass. After a while, he walked over to the big tree and stood next to the big rock. Rain dripped from the top of his head, falling on the top of his head and flowing down his cheeks, but he didn't seem to care at all. His gaze became brighter and sharper, even faintly fierce. He looked everywhere, and finally lowered his head, looking at his feet. The ground was black, wet and dirty soil, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on it. Who knew how many years had passed, day after day, year after year, piling up here? Many of the withered leaves seemed to have rotted, their scorched and withered color similar to the color of the soil. Perhaps after a while, these rotten leaves would also become a part of the soil. Lu Qin stared at the black soil and withered leaves at his feet, thinking silently for a long time. Then he suddenly raised his head and took a deep breath. In the ancient land of the divine Central Plains, there had been a saying passed down from ancient times, to be buried in peace. This meant that no matter how a person lived, they would eventually die. Only after death could they be buried in the ground, in the boundless ancient soil, would the dead feel at ease, and would find the best place to return to in this life. No one had ever thought about what it was like to be buried in the soil, because only the dead would lie deep underground, covered by the soil. Lu Qin wasn't a dead person, but on this day, he was lying in the black soil of this place. In a very strange way, he was like a cold snake hiding in the shadows. The damp, black, dirty soil was mixed with rotten leaves, and there were even all sorts of unimaginable insects, as well as a nauseating stench. This was not a place an ordinary person could stay in. However, Lu Qin was like a dead man as he stopped under the dark soil. The black soil and thick, withered leaves completely covered his body. After the rain fell from the sky for a night, there was no longer any trace of his existence in the forest. There was only an extremely thin, hollow twig stuck into the soil amidst the withered leaves. It stood unremarkable, and after a long time, it would tremble slightly. The rain continued for an entire night. Chapter 217. Another night passed. The rain stopped in the morning, but the sky was still hazy. The dark clouds continued to gather, and it looked like it would rain again at any time. After a night of rain, Kunlun Mountain appeared much clearer and brighter in the morning. A fresh breeze blew across the mountain range, bringing with it a moist smell. However, amidst this beautiful scenery, there were a few places in Kunlun Mountain that remained unchanged. One was the forbidden area with thick fog beneath the clouds in the sky. All the rain that fell on the fog seemed to disappear, not affecting it in the slightest. The other place was the martyr's grave. This place that was hidden in a dark corner at the back of the nameless mountain seemed to always be dark and gloomy. Even the morning breeze seemed unwilling to blow over. However, on this morning, in the dark courtyard of the martyr's grave, there were waves of dull echoes. Sometimes it was intense, sometimes it was soothing. Rays of strange light flickered incessantly in the darkness, emitting magnificent splendor. At the same time, a powerful aura burst forth. Sometimes, even the ground beneath their feet would tremble a few times. After a long time, the fierce battle in the courtyard of the martyr's grave finally came to a stop. The various rays of light dimmed and disappeared. All kinds of sounds stopped as well. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. In the dark courtyard, Dongfang Tao and the corpse watcher stood facing each other. Dongfang Tao's expression was solemn, while the corpse watcher's expression was ugly. Of course, the corpse watcher's expression had always been extremely ugly, so it was impossible to tell what he was feeling at the moment. After a while, Dongfang Tao was the first to speak. "How is it?" The corpse watcher glared at him fiercely, but after a moment, he still fished out a small bottle from his bosom and tossed it to him. Dongfang Tao reached out to catch it and opened it to take a look. There was only a white spirit pill in the bottle. He frowned and asked, "How do I take it?" The corpse watcher said in a hoarse voice, "Just take it with water. After that, you'll feel sleepy. Sleep well for 2 days, and you'll naturally be fine." Dongfang Tao nodded and closed the lid again, putting it back into his bosom. The corpse watcher looked at him coldly and suddenly sneered, "Sure enough, after cultivating to the Yuanying realm, you've become arrogant. You actually dare to take the initiative to fight?" Dongfang Tao shook his head and said, "Firstly, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to ask for the antidote. You were the one who insisted on forcing me to have a spar with you. I had no choice but to do so. Secondly, does winning against you make me arrogant? I don't quite understand what you mean." The zombie's face turned uglier by the second, but he probably knew that since he had lost, there was nothing more to say. He grunted coldly and turned around, wanting to leave. However, at this time, Dongfang Tao opened his mouth to stop him, saying, "I say, this kind of mind-controlling technique of yours is too overbearing. If you act so recklessly in the future, it will easily attract trouble." The zombie paused for a while, but he did not seem to mind. He said coldly, "I didn't expect you to think for me." Dongfang Tao said indifferently, "After all, we are fellow apprentices. By the way, are there any taboos after taking this antidote?" The zombie said rather impatiently, "What taboo? It's fine. It's just that the mind-controlling technique involves some hidden dangers in the brain. If it wasn't for the sudden great change of heaven and earth during the course of the medicinal effect within 2 days after taking the medicine, other than the possibility of affecting the medicinal effect, there wouldn't be any problems at all." Dongfang Tao nodded, appearing to be at ease. In the first place, the great change of heaven and earth was a major event. It was hard to say if it had happened even once in tens of thousands of years, much less thousands of years. The possibility of it happening was extremely small. When Xin came to find Su Qingjun outside the flowing fragrance garden tea house, the latter was standing in the corridor looking at the green banana leaves that had been washed by the raindrops. She looked a little lost in thought. Xin jumped over and pulled Su Qingjun, calling out with a smile, "Sister Su." Su Qingjun was startled, but when she saw that it was Xin, she immediately smiled and said, "Little sister, you've come?" Xin grunted in response, then looked around and asked, "Why are you standing here? Are you waiting for someone?" Su Qingjun said, "Oh, Sumo is resting in the guest room now. This morning, Senior Uncle Dongfang Tao went out to find the antidote for my brother. I'm feeling a little uneasy, so I wanted to wait here for him to return." Xin nodded and smiled. "It's fine. Since my master said so, he'll definitely be able to do it. Don't worry, Sister Su." Su Qingjun smiled and nodded. Xin looked around to make sure no one was around, then pulled on Su Qingjun's sleeve and said, "Right, Sister Su, I've been looking for a long time yesterday and finally found Brother Lu." Su Qingjun raised her eyebrows slightly, and there seemed to be a glimmer of light in her bright eyes, but her expression didn't change. She only said softly, "Oh, how was it?" Xin smiled and said, "I caught him and gave him a good scolding. I scolded him until he bled like a dog. I helped you vent your anger." Su Qingjun was taken aback and said, Why did you scold him?" Xin stole a glance at Su Qingjun's expression and said, "That person is too stupid. I had to scold him. I scolded him for his own good. I must scold him to wake him up." Su Qingjun wanted to say something but stopped. After a while, she smiled bitterly and shook her head without saying anything. Xin said, "I told him that he is cruel and unscrupulous. He doesn't know what's good for him. From the beginning to the end, it was Sister Su who treated him kindly, taking him in and taking care of him. Why did he, a servant disciple, become so arrogant and arrogant? Am I right, Sister Su?" Su Qingjun looked a little embarrassed and said, Sister Xin, you can't say that." Xin stretched out her hand to stop Su Qingjun and said, "Sister, don't worry about it. Anyway, I told him clearly that he must come back and apologize to you. If you don't forgive him, let him kowtow to you and ask for forgiveness. Well, let him kneel in front of your cave residence's stone door for 10 days to half a month. Let's see if he still remembers." Su Qingjun's cheeks turned red and she shook her head repeatedly. No. If you say that, Lu Chen, he'll probably die of anger." Xin snorted and said, "He still dares to be angry? He still dares to show you his face after doing something wrong. I'll be letting him off easy if I don't hit him." As she spoke, her expression changed, and she pulled Su Qingjun's hand with a grin. "But sister, look at Brother Lu. He's all alone. He's lost his parents since he was young, and he's suffered countless hardships. In addition, his talent is poor. He's already so old, yet he still hasn't accomplished anything. He's also not handsome. He really doesn't have anything. It's too miserable. Why don't you just take pity on him and let him come back? Su Qingjun sighed and said, "Your words are too harsh. Actually, I'm not angry at him. From the beginning to the end, he left on his own. If he really wants to return to Flying Goose Terrace, then come back." As she said that, her voice became softer and a trace of red flashed across her face. But she still said it clearly. Xian was overjoyed. She clapped her hands and said, "That's good. When I get back, I'll tell Brother Lu and let him come back to apologize to you." Humph. If you ask me, men are so stupid. They can live a peaceful life, but they insist on making trouble. As she said that, she had a disapproving look on her face. It seemed that she despised Lu Chen very much. Su Qingjun smiled and nodded. But when she thought of how Lu Chen looked when he left that day, she felt that it wasn't as simple as Xian said. But thinking about it, Xian wouldn't lie to her. She said that she was going to find Lu Chen, so she must have found him and said those words. When Lu Chen's face flashed across her mind, Su Qingjun had a faint strange feeling. After a moment of silence, she said to Xian, "Sister Xian, how about this? Tomorrow is the sect's council meeting. As Jindan Friar, I have to participate. I can't leave. After tomorrow, if he's willing, you can bring him to see me at any time. Okay?" Xian clapped her hands and said with a smile, "Okay, I got it." Actually, when I told Brother Lu about this yesterday, he also mentioned this point. He said that you'll be very busy these few days and asked me not to disturb you. As she said that, Xian smiled and said, "See, the two of you have telepathy. You're thinking of the same thing." Su Qingjun blushed and said angrily, "Hey, sister, don't talk nonsense. These things. Everyone can think of these things, they can see it. What's there to care about telepathy? Nonsense." Xian covered her mouth and giggled. Su Qingjun didn't know why, but her mood suddenly seemed to be a lot better. She felt relaxed and said to Xian, "Anyway, this matter is settled. You can come with him later." "Oh, but there's still a troublesome matter." Xian said, "What is it?" Su Qingjun said, "I'm going to attend the sect council tomorrow. Dongfang Shirshu and Melaleuca Japonica Shirshu will also be there. But Sumo can't leave him alone yet. It feels a little. It's fine." Xian said readily, "I'll help you look after him. It's only a day." Su Qingjun said gratefully, "Then I'll trouble you, sister." "Thank you." Xian smiled and said, "No need to thank me. It's just a small matter." As she said, she moved closer and put her face on Su Qingjun's fair and tender cheek. She said softly with a smile, "As long as you promise to let Brother Lu come back, it'll be fine." Su Qingjun patted Xian's forehead and scolded with a smile, "You little girl, I'm also curious. You don't seem to care about other people like this. Why are you only so concerned about Lu Chen? Don't tell me you've fallen in love with him?" Xian was stunned, then her cheeks turned red. She stamped her feet and said, "Sister Su, what nonsense are you talking about? I only help Brother Lu because he's pitiful. Who would like him?" As she spoke, she muttered to herself, "He has no money, no power, and is in dire straits. His talent is poor, and he's not even handsome. If I were blind, would I fall for him?" Su Qingjun laughed for a moment and didn't care. Hearing footsteps at the door, it seemed that Dongfang Tao had returned. She hurriedly called Xian and rushed to the door. In the corridor, Xian didn't immediately follow. She frowned slightly and looked at the banana leaves outside the corridor. Suddenly, she was lost in thought. After a while, she suddenly shook her head, pouted and said angrily, "Who would like him, humph?" Chapter 218. There was only one night left before the night of the full moon, but it was still cloudy in Kunlun Mountain. After the sky darkened, it began to rain again. This rain seemed to be heavier than yesterday. It was mixed with the cold wind blowing from the north, and there was a chill that seeped into one's skin. The world seemed to be filled with a cold and murderous aura. In the cold wind and rain, the forest seemed to be shivering in the dark night. In the forest, a black shadow walked out from a dark corner. A little fire burned in its eyes. It was Atsu. At this moment, for some reason, the black dog's body had swelled to more than double its usual size. At the same time, a pair of sharp, snow-white fangs emerged from its mouth, emitting a chilling glow in the night. There was dark red blood dripping from its lips and teeth. Behind it, one could vaguely see a dead monster on the ground. Its blood was washed by the rain and flowed to the ground. Atsu's footsteps were also a little unstable. It seemed that the battle just now was not easy for it. There was blood dripping from its body, mixed with the rain and dyed its fur red. Half of the blood was from the dead monster, and the other half flowed from the wounds on Atsu's body. In the cold night, the blood flowed, but it gradually emitted a mysterious aura. It was ferocious and powerful, but it also seemed to have a slightly tempting fragrance. It was like the sacrificial offerings on the ancient demonic god's altar. The fragrance was carried away by the wind, drifting through the dark night, the ceaseless rain, and the mountains and forests. Gradually, the dark night started to stir. There was a beast's roar in the distance, rising and falling. Atsu stopped and turned its only eye to look into the distance. Then, it looked back at the wounds and blood on its body. The rain gradually became heavier. The cold wind blew mournfully, and the cold rainwater wrapped in knives hit its body. The darkness in front of him surged, as if attracted by this fragrance that suddenly appeared. In this vast night, countless terrifying and ferocious auras suddenly approached this nameless forest. The green flames in Atsu's single eye flickered. Then, he shook off the rain on his body and continued to move forward. The night grew darker, and the wind and rain became more intense. It slowly walked up to the highest point of the mountain. However, when it raised its head to look at the night sky, in the cold and dark sky, there was only wind and rain and dark clouds. There was not a trace of the moon. On this night that was only one day away from the full moon, on this night that should have been bright and full, only the cold rain covered the world. It carried with it the endless darkness and the terrifying aura of the shadows as it pounced towards the black dog. It was late at night, and it was raining heavily on Kunlun Mountain. This night was unexpectedly cold. Even the cultivators who had always cultivated and were not afraid of the cold and heat would feel a chill. Therefore, except for the disciples who patrolled the mountain, most people stayed in their residences. They either meditated or listened to the sound of the rain, waiting for the heavy rain and the dark night to pass. Jinren Idle Month was alone in his room. Because of his special identity, as the Jinren of the Kunlun party, he did not have his own cave like most Yuanying realm Jinren, nor did he live on the winter peak between the clouds because he was the eldest disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. Although, logically speaking, he could receive both kinds of treatment. Since he was the Jinren of Kunlun, he could only live in one place, which was the Zhengyang Hall of Tiankuan Peak. This was the place where the previous Jinren of the Kunlun party lived. It was the center of the power of the entire Kunlun party. For thousands of years, many extraordinary people and peerless figures had appeared here, and many shocking events had happened here. However, as time passed, geniuses came and went, but only the silent mountain peak and the towering hall had always stood here, never changing. In the dead of the night, Jinren Idle Month had no intention of sleeping. He lit a candle and closed the door and windows. When the wind and rain outside blew against the closed window, he was in front of the bronze mirror in the room, wearing a solemn dress that only the Jinren of Kunlun could wear. This dress was solemn, elegant, and beautiful. Under normal circumstances, there was no opportunity to wear it, unless there was a special festival or a major event. Only then would the Jinren of Kunlun wear this dress. Over the years, the Kunlun party had been peaceful, so Jinren Idle Month only had one opportunity to wear it a year. It was tomorrow. His hand gently stroked the solemn and dignified gown, and a trace of complacency and pride appeared on his face. In this life, although there were twists and turns and pain on the road of cultivation, in general, it could be considered to be very smooth. The achievements he had achieved at this age had far exceeded most people in this world. He could indeed be proud. However, in front of him, there was still a long road ahead of him on that seemingly endless path from the ancient times to the present. However, Daoist Master Idle Moon felt that he could already see his master's tall and broad back. Perhaps one day, he would truly be able to catch up to him. At that time, what would it feel like? Jinren Idle Month smiled and looked at his majestic self in the bronze mirror. The Heavenly Soldier Hall was one of the most important and powerful halls in the Kunlun party. The head, Dukhan Jinren, was also highly respected in the sect and had an illustrious reputation. On this night, Dukhan Jinren stayed in his cave residence. Similar to Jinren Idle Month on Tianquan Peak, Dukhan Jinren was also in a good mood. He had supported the head of the sect, Immortal Idle Moon, for many years. In these years, although the Kunlun sect was peaceful to the outside world, there were always some fights at the level of Immortal of Yuanying stage that would not be seen by others. Some people did not like Jinren Idle Month and did not want Jinren Idle Month to take the position of the Jinren sect master. But Jinren Idle Month himself was very outstanding. Not to mention, he had a true monarch master who was second to none in terms of cultivation and reputation. Therefore, from the beginning, Dukhan Jinren firmly stood on the side of Jinren Idle Month. He was his pawn, his left and right hand, waving the flag and shouting for Jinren Idle Month. Finally, he obtained the trust of Jinren Idle Month and the true monarch behind him. This trust quickly gave Dukhan Jinren a huge return. It made him and his Heavenly Soldier Hall famous in the sect. They also obtained more and more cultivation resources. There was nothing better than this. Dukhan Jinren was very satisfied with the choice he had made for so many years. He had never wavered in the slightest. Watching the night pass, he would still stand beside Jinren Idle Month at the sect council meeting tomorrow, waving the flag and shouting for him. Of course, before that, he would go with his favorite disciple, He, to catch that hateful traitor of the devil cult. Dukhan Jinren closed his eyes with a smile and began to meditate. At the same time, in a place not far from his cave, He, who was also from the Heavenly Soldier Hall, was also awake. He quietly stood under the eaves, watching the rain falling from the cold and dark night sky. In front of his eyes, the rain dripped down from the eaves, rustling into his ears, turning into thousands of crystal-clear water droplets floating in the wind. Finally, they fell on the bluestone floor on the ground and quietly burst into pieces. In the darkness, the water droplets turned into powder and flowed into the depths of the distant darkness. His face was a little pale, probably because of the chill brought by the cold wind. The powder of the rain fell on his face, but he did not move an inch. He stared into the distance of the night, his mouth moved a few times, as if he was whispering to someone. That night, Su Qingjun stayed in the guest room of the Flowing Fragrance Garden. Dongfang Tao kept his promise and brought her the antidote that was said to be able to cure Sumo. After taking the antidote, Sumo immediately fell into a deep sleep and did not wake up. According to Dongfang Tao, this was a normal situation. Usually, one would sleep for at least 2 or 3 days. At the same time, he told Su Qingjun some things that needed to be paid attention to and taboo things. Su Qingjun was naturally very grateful for this. Since Sumo was unconscious and injured, it was inconvenient for him to move around, so she stayed here to take care of him. Her family in Kunwa City also sent people back with the news, so it was easy to imagine how happy her parents were. She walked to the bed and looked at Sumo. She saw that he was sleeping very quietly, even a bit like a child. She suddenly became somewhat absent-minded. She suddenly remembered the appearance of her younger brother when he was born many years ago, as well as the many cute moments when he slowly grew up. Her eyes gradually softened, and she gently pulled the blanket over Sumo a little tighter. She thought to herself that after this incident, she would take some time to properly teach Sumo a lesson. He had been so cute since he was young, and his nature was not bad. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew open the window and extinguished the candles in the room. Su Qingjun walked over and closed the window again. Before completely closing the window, she glanced at the dark night outside. She suddenly thought, on such a rainy night, where is that person now, and what is he doing? In a dark and quiet forest, the damp rainwater continuously poured into the soil, mixed with the smell of decay, giving people a creepy feeling. A poisonous snake slowly crawled out of the grass, bending its body as it crawled forward. However, when it was about to reach the ground covered with rotten leaves, the snake suddenly stopped. It raised its triangular head and hissed its tongue at the front. A gloomy light flashed in its ice-cold vertical pupils. After a moment, the snake suddenly changed direction and crawled to the side. And on the quiet soil, under the rotten leaves, a small hollow branch slightly trembled, then became quiet again, hiding in the darkness, quietly waiting. It was the coming dawn. Chapter 219. On the day of the full moon, the sky brightened very late. It was probably because there were still thick dark clouds in the sky that had yet to disperse, and even the sun had yet to be seen. However, in the early morning, the rain that had been raining for an entire night gradually stopped, as if to give the world some time to breathe. Even the cold wind had disappeared. As the sky slowly brightened, the Kunlun mountain that had been immersed in the miserable wind and rain for an entire night seemed to slowly come back to life, and gradually became lively. The people in the mountain each did their own thing. After that, some of the Kunlun cultivators with higher status walked towards the direction of Tian Kun Peak from all directions one after another. The annual sect council of the Kunlun party lasted for a day, and could basically be divided into two sessions, one big and one small. The big session started in the day, and was the grandest. The participants were almost all the elites of the Kunlun party, all the cultivators above the Jin Dan realm, and a small number of the most outstanding genius disciples in the foundational realm would participate. On the other hand, the small session was much smaller. It was held at night, and the participants were only the 10 or so Jinren of the Yuanying realm. Although there was a huge difference in the size of the big session and the small session, in terms of importance, it was actually the small session at night, where the discussion at the level of the Yuanying Jinren seemed to be more important. Perhaps because of this, during the big session during the day, there were not many Yuanying Jinren of the Yuanying Jinren who came to Tiankuan Peak's Jingyang Hall. Those who could come, in fact, had tacitly expressed their support for Jinren of the idle month. Most people below the Yuanying Jinren of the Yuanying Jinren would not feel these subtle things that could only be understood, but the Kunlun party was so big, and there were also many elite cultivators. There were always some smart people who had sharp ears and eyes, and were experienced in the ways of the world, and could see some things. At this time, there were already many people in the majestic and spacious Jinyang Hall. At the same time, there were still people coming from outside the hall, making the solemn hall that symbolized the center of power of the Kunlun party become lively, which was rarely seen. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica also came here. When they walked into the hall, many Jin Dan friar and foundational realm cultivators who passed by saluted to Dongfang Tao. This was a natural respect for the strong cultivators of the Yuanying realm. It should be known that among the countless cultivators in the world, those who could cultivate to the level of Yuanying Jinren might not even be 1 in 100,000, let alone 1 in 10,000. Dongfang Tao's expression was indifferent, and did not reveal any arrogance, nor did he reveal any overly gentle expression. In general, he looked, he looked up. This was the expression that most Yuanyingzhenren of the lower level. Yen Luo looked around and said with a smile, "It's indeed impressive. It's different now that you're a nascent soul-perfected cultivator." Dongfang Tao's expression did not change. His expression was still solemn, but he said in a low voice, "This is all because I am afraid of trouble. If I were to give those people a slightly better attitude, do you believe that there would be people who would immediately try to befriend me and ask for advice?" Melaleuca Japonica smiled. She did not refute his words. She probably knew what was going on in her heart. However, since this matter did not concern her, she could not be bothered to care. She only smiled and said, "In any case, it has nothing to do with me. I will follow you. This year, I will be able to get a good seat." Dongfang Tao smiled. His gaze turned and saw that most of the people were standing in the center of Zhengyang Hall. However, the special small tables at the side of the hall were mostly empty. At a glance, there were only 2 or 3 people. As if sensing Dongfang Tao's gaze, those people also turned their heads and looked over. Both parties' gazes met in mid-air, after which they politely nodded to each other in greeting, and then turned their gazes away. Melaleuca Japonica's voice came from the side. This time, she also lowered her voice and said softly, "Not many people came." At this time, there were already many people standing in Zhengyang Hall. Furthermore, there were still people coming in from outside the door. It showed that the Kunlun party was thriving. Of course, it could not be that not many people came. However, Dongfang Tao's expression did not change. He said, "It is still early. There should be more people by afternoon." Melaleuca Japonica looked at him and said, "I thought you would only come at night." Dongfang Tao was silent for a moment. Then, he sighed and said, "You also understand these things in the sect. Those who came today during the day more or less have an explanation. At least, it can let the sect leader and the true monarch know my intentions." Melaleuca Japonica nodded and said, "You are right. It is just that I really thought that after you cultivated Yuanying, you would be as honest as before and not stand out to express your stance." Dongfang Tao shook his head. A bitter smile flitted across the corner of his mouth. He said, "It is not that I did not think that way. But when I really reached my current position, only then did I realize that there are also difficulties. The number of Yuanying Zenrens is too few." As he said this, Dongfang Tao looked at the empty tables at the side and said softly, "In the past, I could hide and fight because there were many Jin Dan Friar Zenrens. But there are only a dozen or so Yuanying Zenrens. It is clear who is right and who is wrong. Everyone is staring at you. You have no choice but to express your stance." Melaleuca Japonica sighed and said, "So, you chose the sect leader's side?" Dongfang Tao said, "If I don't choose Senior Brother Idol Month's side, what else can I choose? Am I really going to rely on Senior Brother Qiandang and Mingzhu from Baichao Tang's side? The sect leader's faction is now the strongest in our sect. Senior Brother Idol Month also has Hakushin Jinkuan backing him. Who can compete with him? Since I don't have any backing, if I want to find one, of course, I have to find the thickest thigh to cling to." Melaleuca Japonica shrugged and said, "You are right. If it were me, I would probably choose the same." Dongfang Tao smiled and glanced at the high and mighty main seat in the hall in the distance. He said, "Just watch. There will definitely be a lot of Yuanying Zenrens coming today. I heard that Uncle Master Bai Chen might be coming today." Yen Luo was taken aback. She said in a low voice, "Didn't he say that he was going to cultivate in peace last year and would no longer participate in the sect review meeting?" Dongfang Tao smiled without saying a word. Melaleuca Japonica quickly reacted and shook her head with a wry smile. Then, as if she suddenly thought of something, she said to Dongfang Tao, "But I haven't seen that person from the Heavenly Soldier Hall today. That's a little strange." Dongfang Tao thought for a moment and nodded. "Well, now that you mention it, I also feel it. Senior Brother Dukong has always been a strong supporter of Senior Brother Idle Month. He has always been the first to come in the past. I didn't expect him to be late today. But he will definitely come. It's probably because something urgent happened at the Heavenly Soldier Hall. Melaleuca Japonica grunted in acknowledgement. Clearly, she didn't pay much attention to the matter. Instead, her eyes suddenly lit up. She saw a beautiful and outstanding woman walking in from the entrance of Zhengyang Hall. It was Su Qingjun. From afar, Su Qingjun seemed to see them. She immediately smiled, waved at the two, and bowed slightly. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica both smiled and nodded. Melaleuca Japonica said with some emotion, "This young lady is really not bad. It would be great if I could accept such a disciple in the future." Dongfang Tao chuckled and didn't say anything. In the Heavenly Soldier Hall, Dukonjinren was dressed neatly. He looked radiant and in high spirits. His bearing was very dignified and awe-inspiring. As for he accompanied him all the way out. According to the results of yesterday's discussion, after Dukonjinren left the Heavenly Soldier Hall, he did not immediately head to Tianquan Peak Zhengyang Hall. Instead, he turned and walked towards the direction of the house where Changxing died. Anyway, although the big meeting during the day was very grand and enthusiastic, the importance was not as important as the small meeting at night. What was more important was that there was a chance to catch the evil faction spy, which was a great merit. Dukonjinren could even imagine, when he caught the evil faction spy and threw him in front of sect head Senior Brother, Idle Month Senior Brother would be surprised and pleasantly surprised. And from this, there was no need to say how highly Idle Month Senior Brother would regard him. The person that others couldn't catch, Dukonjinren had done it and caught him. Wasn't this enough to explain the problem? Dukonjinren was in a good mood and his footsteps were not slow. And he had been following his master all the way to that abandoned house. Then according to the clues left behind, the meeting place with the evil faction spy, should be in the nearby vast mountain forest. At this time, the surroundings were very quiet, there was no one walking around. There were quite a number of odd job disciples living in this place, but they had nothing to do with the grand sect meeting that was currently being held. In fact, most of the odd job disciples had gone to work as usual. Dukonjinren didn't mind at all and soon strode towards that stretch of forest. He watched his master's back figure, a trace of complicated expression flashed past his eyes, but very quickly he still followed closely. Just that when both of them walked to the edge of that stretch of forest and were about to enter, Dukonjinren suddenly frowned and stopped his footsteps. He was stunned for a moment and said, "Master, what's wrong?" Dukonjinren muttered to himself, I suddenly thought of something. This evil faction spy matter is not a small matter. By right, before I make a move, I still have to inform sect head Senior Brother, at least after a discussion, get his permission before making a move." Speaking, Dukonjinren turned around and looked like he was about to leave. He was taken aback and hurriedly stopped him, said, "Master, where are you going?" Dukonjinren said, "I am going to Tianquan Peak, to discuss with Idle Month Senior Brother, in case he has other plans and temporarily doesn't want to catch this spy. Wouldn't I be beating the grass and alerting the snake by going in this time?" Speaking, he smiled and said to Shao we have to consider everything thoroughly before doing things, we must not be rash. Let's go see Idle Month Senior Brother first." He was stunned when he saw Dukonjinren turned and walked away. His face suddenly turned pale, even a layer of cold sweat faintly appeared on his forehead. Chapter 220. Teacher, hold on. He suddenly called out. Dukonjinren halted his steps, turned back and looked at said, "What is it?" He's mind turned rapidly, his eyes flickered slightly, his mouth instead said, "Disciple thinks, we still have to continue to the forest, to capture that evil faction spy." Dukonjinren frowned, for a moment pondered, although he had already decided to return to Tianquan Peak to discuss with Reverend Idle Month before taking action, but he was his proudest and most valued disciple, the weight of his words was naturally different from others, so for a moment he was somewhat hesitant. He took advantage of this rare moment, his eyes flashed and then suddenly took a step forward, stood beside Dukanjinren, lowered his voice and said, "Teacher, disciple thinks, this matter is a great merit, but this merit should be personally received by you." Dukanjinren's eyes flashed, after a moment of silence, said, "What do you mean by that?" He took a deep breath and said, "After you capture the evil faction spy and detain him to Tianquan Peak, then the merit of eliminating the spy will be mostly credited to you, but if you first make a trip to Tianquan Peak, at that time, I'm afraid everyone will say that this matter was planned by sect head reverend who commanded the overall situation, and teacher you are at most a hired thug. Do you think what I said makes sense?" Dukanjinren's eyes narrowed slightly. After a moment he said, "Me and Idle Month's senior brother are like brothers, all these years we have been supporting each other, this merit or not, actually it is not too important, right?" He's expression had already completely calmed down, heard the words and smiled, said to Dukanjinren, "Teacher, you have always been wise and far-sighted, I don't believe that you have not thought of this. If you get the merit, it means that your ability is stronger, Idle Month Reverend should value you more, other than that, I think." Speaking till here, He's voice suddenly lowered, softly said, "In this sect, between the clouds and the sky, isn't there still a deity realm true monarch? Teacher, we all know, that is the real emperor. For you to do a good job in this matter, you will only be able to reach that perfected lord's ears if you obtain the greatest merit. Otherwise, if you were to inform perfected sect master first, I'm afraid perfected Lord Bai Chen will think that this matter was planned by Uncle Master Idle Moon and that you are just an ordinary fighter." Dukanjinren's heart suddenly palpitated, a yearning expression appeared on his face, but he seemed to still have some misgivings, looked at He, and said in a low voice, "The real master of the Kunlun party now is Hakushin Jinkuan, I naturally know this in my heart. But no matter what, Idle Month is also the true monarch's personal disciple, there is a difference between close and distant, it is very difficult for me to surpass him, right?" He smiled and said, "Teacher, disciple did not purposely provoke the relationship between you and Reverend Idle Month, it is just that there is no need to inform him about this matter in advance, you did not do anything wrong at all. What's more, this matter was originally ordered by Reverend Idle Month, I found something and gave it to you, teacher, isn't it also the right thing to do?" Dukanjinren pondered over and indeed felt that what he said was right, immediately clapped his hands, smiled and said, "What you said is indeed reasonable. My relationship with Idle Month's senior brother is naturally very good, but fighting for ourselves once in a while, it does not seem to be a bad thing." He smiled and said, "Isn't that so?" Dukanjinren smiled and nodded, said, "Then let's do it this way, let's go in. The earlier we can catch that cunning and vicious evil sect spy, the earlier we can go back and meet Idle Month's senior brother." Saying that, he turned around and once again walked into the forest, while He behind him, let out a long breath of turbid air, smiled bitterly, looked at Dukanjinren's back figure with a complicated expression, a moment later, he also followed. Not long after, both of their figures disappeared into the forest. Flowing Fragrance Garden, Tea Room Guest Room. Su Qingjun had already left this place, at the same time because her brother Sumo had been unconscious after taking the antidote, it was not suitable for him to go out, so he was temporarily placed in the guest room. Xian also came here early in the morning, because of the agreement with Su Qingjun yesterday, she would help look after Sumo today. Walking to the middle of the room, from afar, she saw Sumo lying unconscious on the bed. Xian took a look and felt that there was nothing serious, so she sat at the desk by the window, looking at the somewhat hazy sky outside. At this time, there seemed to be a slight breeze, some chill drifted in from the window, but Xian did not care much, only felt that it was somewhat deserted. Probably because those with some ability and reputation here had all gone to Tianquan Peak Xingyang Hall, there was not much of a figure in the corridor outside the window. Xian sighed softly, leaned on the table, and thought in her heart, why did this day pass so slowly? If only time could pass faster, by tomorrow, I can go find Lu Chen, and then go see sister Su Qingjun together. Thinking of this, she could not help but smile again, her mood became very good. Even the scene of the gathering dark clouds in the sky outside the room seemed a little brighter in her eyes. Between the clouds and the sky, on the winter peak. This morning, after White Lotus woke up, she felt a little uncomfortable in her heart, a little lazy, but she did not really want to stay in bed. Her mood became inexplicably strange and contradictory. White Lotus remembered that she did not have such strange feelings in the past, but in the recent 2 months, it would suddenly appear every 10 days to half a month. It was also strange. Could it be that this winter peak was too deserted, so my heart felt uncomfortable? But it could also be because of cultivating the ice and snow scripture. White Lotus always felt that ever since her master began to teach her this magical power, this strange feeling gradually appeared from nothing, and gradually increased. But this feeling did not have any harm or other signs. Perhaps it was just a normal reaction to cultivating this peerless magical power? White Lotus was not very clear about the reason here. She thought in her heart, whether she should find a chance to ask her master. After all, her 2 senior brothers did not cultivate this ice and snow scripture, so the only person who could explain her doubts was probably her master. It was just that during this period of time, Hakushin Jinkuan almost always cultivated in his snow-wind cave at the peak of the winter peak. He would not easily show up, even his 3 disciples rarely saw him. Now that the sect meeting was imminent, the old man might come out, but he probably did not have time for White Lotus, so after thinking about it in her heart, White Lotus thought that she would probably have to wait for a while. After dawdling in the cave for a while, White Lotus still felt a little upset. She did not know what was wrong with her today, but she still felt a little uneasy. So in the end, she still walked out of the cave. The sky was full of wind and snow. Almost everywhere in sight was pure white. This was the unique scenery of the winter peak, one of the 4 magical peaks in the sky, almost every day of the year. White Lotus had lived on this winter peak for a while, but most of the time, she was still attracted by this strange and beautiful scenery, the coldness that belonged to the world of ice and snow. It was not something that most people in the world could see. She walked slowly along the mountain path, feeling a little hesitant, wondering if she should go down from the winter peak, and go to the Flying Goose platform to look for Lu Chen again. That person, and that black dog, had some unspeakable secrets, and the one that White Lotus wanted to know the most was also one of those secrets, the secret of the blood food secret method. The sect meeting is such a high-class place, a useless servant disciple like him should not be able to go there, right? White Lotus thought to herself. Just as she was about to turn around and go down the mountain, White Lotus suddenly saw second senior brother Zhuoxian standing on the mountain path in front of her. In the wind and snow, Zhuoxian looked calm, his eyes were bright, and he was looking up at the sky. White Lotus followed his gaze and suddenly found that the sky was still gloomy, but second senior brother's eyes were fixed on the huge figure on the mountain peak. Second senior brother, why are you standing here? White Lotus called out to Zhuoxian. Zhuoxian was startled, and when he turned to see that it was White Lotus, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Ah, it's little junior sister." White Lotus walked over, stood beside Zhuoxian, and said, "Senior brother, are you planning to welcome Master down?" "Actually, it's fine, Master should be coming down when the time comes." Zhuoxian smiled slightly, and said, "It's fine, I have nothing to do anyway, I'll just treat it as waiting for Master to come down." White Lotus suddenly became curious, and asked Zhuoxian, "Second senior brother, is the sect meeting fun?" "I haven't been there yet." Zhuoxian lightly shook his head, and said, "It's not that interesting, those with low skills will flatter each other, and those with high skills will get rid of their dissenters. Finally, and also the most important, Yuanying old man will organize a night party, and only at that time will it be the real sect meeting." White Lotus smiled, and said, "Actually second senior brother, recently you've helped eldest senior brother, and really did a lot of things. Usually, you did the most of the various kinds of communication and organization arrangements, and instead, I think eldest senior brother doesn't seem to be as busy as you." Zhuoxian laughed, and said, "What do you know? Children shouldn't talk nonsense, or else if these words reach eldest senior brother's ears, then you'll be in trouble." White Lotus shrugged, and greeted Zhuoxian, only saying that it was windy here, and that when he went back to rest, she also walked back the way she came, but this time, she had already decided to go down the mountain, and then find that man called Lu Chen. But at this time, suddenly, Zhuoxian's voice came from behind, and called out to her, "Little junior sister." White Lotus turned around, and asked, "What's the matter, second senior brother?" Zhuoxian looked at her appearance, his gaze was very gentle, and after letting out a breath, she heard him say calmly, "It's very cold here today, in a while, even Master and I will be leaving here, why don't you go down the mountain by yourself?" White Lotus was startled, and then looked at Zhuoxian with a surprised expression, and said in surprise, "You're telling me to go down the mountain by myself?" Chapter 221. Go down the mountain to play. Zhuoxian smiled and said, "It's rare for you to have such free time. Otherwise, if Master and eldest senior brother were here, they would only ask you to go and practice." White Lotus was still a little surprised, but she was a little happy in her heart. Ever since she entered the Kunlun party, especially after she became a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, she spent most of her time on the high and mighty winter peak. Other than sneaking down in private, she did not have much contact with the ordinary people in the sect. Of course, the people she had the most contact with were the three people in Hakushin Jinkuan's sect. However, Hakushin Jinkuan was busy with practice, and Immortal Idol Month, as the sect leader of Kunlun, was busy with many affairs. The one who took care of her the most and met her the most was this second senior brother. In fact, White Lotus had a good impression of Zhuoxian, but it was just a good impression. Although Zhuoxian was a veteran Jin Dan friar in the Kunlun party, and his reputation was extremely high, he had a master and a senior brother who were too dazzling. Instead, Zhuoxian seemed a little dim. For ordinary people and ordinary cultivators, the Jin Dan friar realm of 10 years was already the peak that they dreamed of. However, for Zhuoxian, the world often changed their view. Your master is a peerless deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, and your senior brother is a little inferior, but he is also a Yuanying perfected cultivator. At the same time, he also inherited the position of the Kunlun party's sect leader, and his name is known all over the world. Compared to these two geniuses, Jin Dan friar? What was that? There were always people who felt that if others did not reach the expectations that they randomly set in their hearts, it was because that person did not work hard or had poor talent. It was all that person's fault. However, no one really wanted to understand why that person was like that. White Lotus was a mature child. It could even be said that she was terrifyingly mature in private. However, she was still too young, and there would always be some things that she had not experienced or thought of. Just like now, she kept intentionally or unintentionally comparing second senior brother before her with her master and eldest senior brother, and then she got the impression that he seemed to be inferior. However, although his achievements were poor, he was still a good person. Zhuoxian treated White Lotus pretty well. He was probably the person who treated her the best on Winter Peak. White Lotus revealed a rare smile and nodded to Zhuoxian. She thought to herself, this second senior brother really knows how to conduct himself. She quickly walked away. Zhuoxian watched as White Lotus left, his eyes remaining gentle. From the beginning to the end, he saw the changes in White Lotus's expression, but it did not affect him too much. How many years had it been? How many people had intentionally or unintentionally looked down on him? This was very normal, wasn't it? Zhuoxian could even guess what this little girl, White Lotus, was thinking. He knew that she did not do it on purpose. No matter who it was, after having a deity transformation stage master and a nascent soul Daoist master who was also the Kunlun sect leader's senior brother, everyone's expectations of him would become very high. It was so high that if they only cultivated to the level of Jin Dan friar, it would be a kind of sin. The wind and snow blew from afar, and White Lotus's figure disappeared in the distance. The smile on Zhuoxian's face slowly disappeared, and his expression gradually became indifferent. It looked like the wind and snow on this winter peak. It was cold and piercing. He quietly looked at this familiar white world. Every cliff, every icicle, every mountain path, and even every piece of wind and snow that had been blown by, felt so familiar to him. He had spent a long time here. He raised his head and looked at the violent wind and snow at the highest point of this mountain. That place seemed to be above the ninth heaven, as if it was always so high and unreachable. After a while, he suddenly laughed, with a hint of self-mockery. There were still many traces left behind from last night's stormy night. Under the hazy sky, the dark clouds gathered into a thick blanket, slowly rolling, as if they were brewing something. And on a nameless peak outside of Kunlun, a black shadow was slowly walking towards the highest peak. It was Black Dog. After a night, it seemed to have gone through another brutal battle. The bruises all over its body returned to its body. Fresh blood flowed continuously and dyed a large area of the ground red. But Atsu was not the most miserable. There were many more miserable than it, such as those who had fallen dead on both sides of the mountain path, or those who had rolled directly into the cliff and died. The air was filled with a murderous and bloody smell. Some heavy breathing sounds rose and fell, echoing in the shadows of this mountain. Behind Atsu, in the gaps between the grass and the trees, behind the branches and leaves of the forest, one could see some bright or murderous eyes everywhere. At the same time, in the area between these terrifying gazes and Atsu, near the mountain path, there was a scene of chaos. Blood flowed everywhere, flesh and bone fragments could be seen everywhere. It was like a feast of slaughter. Atsu's sharp teeth and the corners of its mouth were dripping with blood. The closer it was to the night of the full moon, the more power Atsu could feel in its body throbbing. It was like a wild volcano that was about to erupt and let out a terrible roar towards the world. It felt as if something was going to happen to it soon. However, the holy blood that flowed out of the tracking holy beast, as well as the numerous demonic beasts that were attracted by the strange blood fragrance, had already surrounded it excitedly. It was the most coveted delicacy in the world for holy beasts. It was a supreme treasure that could make holy beasts obtain great power and use it to advance. This was not a legend, but the instinct of all holy beasts. Therefore, when the terrifying and strange smell of blood spread out, all the demonic beasts within a radius of 100 miles went crazy. The boundary between life and death seemed to no longer be so important at this moment, and their instinctive desires seemed to have taken over. Do you want to stand out? Do you want to go to the top? These waves of hostility, like raging waves and raging tides, are desperately trying to pull you, drag you, hurt you, and murder you. Why can you do it, and why can't I? Eat your flesh, drink your blood, maybe I can too. Therefore, the wind and clouds gathered, and the world was covered in haze. Every step seemed to be accompanied by blood. The black dog had never felt so lonely before. Even when it was young and had followed that man, it had thought that all of this would never happen again. However, at this moment, when it looked up at the hazy sky and breathed in the eerie and terrifying cold wind, it finally understood. It was the only one on this road, and it could only walk alone. The black dog looked back, and its single eye was filled with a cruel light. The auras hidden in the shadows suddenly flinched, as if they were shocked by the ferocity. However, that was all they could do. Before the bloody feast, before the king had reached the top, who would give up on this blood feast? The cold wind blew, and Atsu suddenly thought of Lu Chen. Was that person still on that mountain? After this night of the full moon, would they still be able to see each other? Atsu did not know the answer to this question, and perhaps that person did not know either. It gently shook the remaining half of its tail. This scene suddenly looked a little tragic and comical in the midst of its ferocious and bloody aura. Then, it turned around once again. Even though it was a dog, it seemed to be looking down on the world. It ignored all the greedy gazes, the covetous gazes, and the bloody wounds on its body. Step by step, it faced the wind and walked toward the highest peak of the mountain. It looked forward to the arrival of the night. It looked forward to the appearance of the full moon. Two people stood on the towering city wall of Kunwu City and looked at the majestic Kunlun mountain range in the distance. They were Fan Tui and Chen He. Dark clouds hung low in the hazy sky, stacking on top of each other. Along with the waves of cold wind blowing from the mountain, this caused the world to have a murderous aura. The mountain was so tall that it was like a god. It stood proudly as if it was too high to be reached. Fan Tui and Chen He did not look good. They were a little gloomy. However, in comparison, Fan Tui's eyes were more ferocious, while Chen He was more composed. Amidst the cold wind, Chen He was the first to speak. Is the annual faction meeting of the Kunlun party being held on the mountain? Fan Tui nodded and said, yes. This is the most important event of the year for the Kunlun party. All the important figures will participate. As he spoke, he suddenly grunted and said, if a meteorite suddenly fell from the sky today, it would be able to subdue this damned faction. Even though the atmosphere was originally serious, Chen He, who was usually composed, could not help but laugh when he heard Fan Tui's words. He then shook his head and muttered to himself for a moment, in other words, today on the mountain of Kunlun is the day when the Kunlun party is most concentrated? Fan Tui replied, almost. Chen He asked, do you have any arrangements? Fan Tui was silent for a moment, then said, the enemy is strong, and we are weak. There is nothing we can do. We can only get our spies to watch carefully and not act rashly. Chen He nodded and said, that is also a wise move. He paused for a moment and looked at Fan Tui. Speaking of which, I suddenly have an idea recently. I would like to discuss it with you. Fan Tui said, please speak. Chen He said, the western continent is very vast, and there are many cultivation families. Even though the Kunlun party is very powerful, it seems that we do not need to focus most of our efforts here. What do you think? Fan Tui frowned and did not speak. Chen He smiled and said, even though we have suffered some setbacks previously, our foundations have not been damaged. It is better for us to develop in secret and endure for now. In the future, when the Holy Church recovers and becomes strong again, we can naturally find trouble with these people again. Fan Tui looked at the distant Kunlun mountain and suddenly said, but there is still a brother on the mountain that we have not contacted. That is a person who could set up the reincarnation array. How can we give up so easily? Chen He frowned and muttered, speaking of this, I have been thinking about this matter for the past 2 days. I have a feeling that this matter is a little strange. Chapter 222. Fan Tui was shocked and asked, what's strange? Chen He said, how many people in the Holy Church do you think can draw the reincarnation array? Fan Tui froze for a moment before replying, of course it's a senior with a high level of cultivation. At least 10 years ago, I heard that only the elders of the Holy Church could draw it. Chen He looked at him and said in a deep voice, you are right. That was indeed the case 10 years ago. However, the seniors in the Holy Church have withered. 4 of the 5 great elders of the past have passed away. Only Elder Ghost is left. However, it can't be him. Fan Tui's expression changed slightly. After a moment of silence, he furrowed his brows and said, perhaps it's a disciple left behind by the other elders? Or are they the experts that Elder Ghost has trained over the years? Chen He shook his head and said, that's impossible. I am well aware of the manpower of Elder Ghost. No one would come to Kunlun. As for the disciples left behind by the other 4 elders, there are naturally outstanding geniuses. However, they are also well-known people in the Holy Church. They are definitely not strangers who are hiding here and have cut off all ties with us. Fan Tui's brows furrowed even tighter. He said, based on what you said, this is indeed strange. However, the reincarnation array that appeared on Kunlun Mountain is undoubtedly the real deal from the various information we have received. However, if the person in the Holy Church who can draw this array is not here, how did this array appear? Chen He's expression was dark. He raised his head and looked deeply at Kunlun Mountain, which was shrouded in dark clouds in the distance. Fan Tui continued to mumble beside him, could it be that such a high-level array formation has been leaked? If the person in the Holy Church who can really draw this array is not here, then no one in the world can set it up. No. Suddenly, Chen He interrupted him. At that moment, his expression was suddenly filled with dark clouds. Even his eyes revealed a strong murderous intent. In this world, other than the few heroes in the Holy Church who can set up this array, there is another person with such ability outside of the Holy Church. Fan Tui was shocked and asked, "Who is it?" Chen He clenched his teeth tightly. A moment later, a cold gust of wind seemed to seep out from between his teeth. He said word by word, "A traitor." Clang, the melodious sound of the bell reverberated on the majestic Tiankuan peak. Everyone in the Zhengyang Grand Hall turned around solemnly. The originally somewhat lively and noisy atmosphere quickly subsided, and the Grand Hall fell into silence. Suddenly he heard the sound of clothes fluttering, someone was walking over. The bronze doors at the back of the main hall opened one by one, and a row of Daoist children came out in a single file, with a dragon embroidered on the left and a phoenix on the right. The iron cauldron was emitting green smoke, and the cloud board was emitting an auspicious sound. Cranes soared, beasts roared, and auspicious clouds appeared. There was a tall platform in the majestic main hall. Immortal energy floated about like floating clouds. A moment later, he sat on the main seat, nodded his head and smiled as he looked around. The cloud board rang out in succession, the sound was clear and melodious, each louder than the last, like the waves of a great river, each louder than the last. In a short moment, it actually had the momentum of a magnificent army surging forward. A gust of wind blew across the large hall, fluttering everyone's clothes. The hall was filled with heroes. It was as if the essence of 1,000 years of inheritance had been passed down here. It was the golden age of the human world. They couldn't help but feel a sense of heroism in their hearts. They felt that everything in the world was easy, there was nothing that they couldn't achieve. At the side, there were people singing and greeting, offering sacrifices to the ancestors, the sect, and thanking the heavens and the earth. The people in the seats looked up and saw that everyone was respectful. Looking further away, they also saw those extraordinary people sitting at a small table at the side of the hall. Reverend Idle Month's gaze swept over, those Yuanyingzhenren who supported him also smiled and nodded. Everyone did not specially greet him, as long as he came, it had already explained everything. But the next moment, Reverend Idle Month suddenly frowned. He realized that he actually did not see Dukanzhenren in the crowd. His face slightly darkened, but he quickly relaxed. Dukanzhenren and he were not ordinary friends. All these years, everyone had supported each other. Reverend Idle Month completely did not think that Dukanzhenren would have any estrangement with him, let alone oppose him. Thinking about it, Dukanzhenren probably had some urgent matters to deal with at the Heavenly Soldier Hall. This was also okay. The big meeting during the day was originally glorious, the most important thing was the small meeting tonight. Presumably, at that time, junior brother Dukan would definitely not let him down. At least after so many years, he had never let him down. Reverend Idle Month was relieved, and just as he was about to retract his gaze, his eyes suddenly paused again. He saw that at the back of the crowd, there was a face that was not too familiar to him previously. Dongfang Tao stood at the small table and nodded at Reverend Idle Month from afar. His face was smiling, and his expression was natural. Reverend Idle Month stared at him for a moment, and a trace of a smile slowly floated on his lips. Then, he also smiled and nodded at Dongfang Tao, his eyes filled with gratification. Dukanzhenren and he walked into the depths of the forest. The forest was deep, and the light was somewhat dim. Because of the rain 2 days ago, the ground in the forest had also become wet and soft, and some places were even covered in mud, looking very dirty. However, of course, these things would not be a problem for two cultivators with cultivation, especially since their cultivation was extremely high. One was the newly advanced Jin Dan Friar, and the other was Reverend Yuanying, who had been famous for many years. Drops of water dripped from the edges of the branches and leaves, and the soft sound seemed to make the forest seem even more quiet. Perhaps it was because the rain was too heavy, there were no traces of wild beasts in the vicinity, and even the occasional chirping of birds was rarely heard today. Light and shadow intertwined and changed on their faces, reflecting different expressions. It was as if black and white were constantly intertwining, walking in the light and darkness. The sound of footsteps could be heard as they stepped on the ground. Under the big tree, beside the big rock, in the rotten leaves and black mud, a small and inconspicuous branch trembled slightly. After a moment, the two figures appeared in this place. Dukonjinren looked around, his eyes sharp, and asked He, "Is this the place?" He took a step forward and said, "Yes." Dukonjinren nodded, took 2 steps forward and said, "Right now no one is here yet. Where is the place where you first discovered the evil sect talisman? Let me see." He nodded and said, "Teacher, please wait for a moment, I remember it is behind that big rock." After speaking, he strode towards that big rock. Dukonjinren stood where he was, turned and looked around. The surrounding forest was densely forested, far more than the outskirts of the forest. In the dim corners, shadows could be seen, as if there were always some strange gazes looking at this place in the darkness. Dukonjinren frowned, feeling somewhat unhappy. He thought, as expected, the evil sect's evil people were all cowardly and weak, even arranging to meet at these ghostly and shady places. It was really pitiful and laughable. And at this moment, not more than 3 chi away from his feet, under a few withered and rotten leaves, that tree branch stopped there, not moving at all. At this moment, He had already walked behind that big rock. Dukonjinren stood still and waited. That tree branch was like a dead object, everything seemed to have frozen in that instant, as if time had stopped. Suddenly a breeze blew past, bringing with it a slight chill. "Ah!" Suddenly, a loud cry was heard from behind the big rock. It was He's voice, unusually tragic, with some traces of surprise. Dukonjinren's body shook, suddenly turned around and saw his most beloved disciple, He, staggering and retreating from behind the big rock, spitting out fresh blood, hoarsely shouted, "Ming Zhu Shu, why is this?" Dukonjinren's body shook again, while he was still in shock. Indeed, in front of He, a figure turned out from behind the big rock. It was a face that could not be more familiar. It was Ming Zhu. At that moment, huge waves surged in Dukonjinren's heart. No matter what, he would never have thought, the one he waited for was an illustrious and famous person who was not any weaker than himself, Yuanyingjinren from the Kunlun party. Could it be that he was the evil sect spy? And without waiting for Dukonjinren to react, that Ming Zhu cold eyes swept over, also saw him. At that moment, Dukonjinren saw that Ming Zhu face suddenly revealed a shocked expression, followed by a trace of anger, shouted towards this side, "Dukong. It's actually you. So you are the evil sect spy." Hearing that, Dukonjinren was shocked. Just as he was about to open his mouth to explain, suddenly he heard the sound of the wind behind him. In an instant, as if the mountains were collapsing, the earth was cracking, the deep sea was raging, a few incomparably violent auras simultaneously rose from the depths of the forest, pressing towards him with a loud bang. Dukonjinren shouted, but did not turn around. Instead, he directly rushed forward. In front of him, Ming Zhu face was as calm as water. With a kick, he sent He flying, his sleeves fluttered, his whole body flew into the air. The surrounding spiritual light instantly condensed into a 10 feet light sword, directly chopping down. Wherever it passed, dust flew, trees fell, rocks cracked. Dukonjinren's eyes widened, his hands suddenly made a circle, a part of the cloud condensed into a shield, blocking in front of his body, only to hear a loud bang. That unstoppable light sword collided with the cloud shield, an ear-piercing sound was heard. Immediately after, both turned into nothingness. At the same time, the raging aura behind him had already reached him. At this critical moment, Dukonjinren fully displayed the foundation of his many years of fame as a Yuanying enlightened master. His body shone brilliantly, and 3 magic treasures appeared one after another, turning into a pagoda, a bell, and a halberd. At this critical moment, he forcibly blocked the soul-chasing attack, flipped his body, and forcibly rushed out from the side. Even so, his chest was stuffy, and a mouthful of blood directly sprayed out from his chest. When he turned around, he saw 3 people walking out of the forest, causing his expression to greatly change. Impressively, it was Enlightened Master Qian Deng, Enlightened Master Guangyang, and Masato Kihara, the 3 great Yuanying Enlightened Masters. He saw Enlightened Master Qian Deng at the forefront, glaring at them and shouting, "Du Kong! You colluded with the evil sect to infiltrate our sect. This is truly a heinous crime. Why don't you surrender now?" Du Kong was aghast. "Preposterous, you are all slandering me." However, after all, he was not an ordinary person, and in a flash, he saw through the treacherous situation. He sneered, "You want to slander me, but don't even think about it. I will go find Senior Brother Sect Master to explain." With that said, his body moved, and he was about to fly into the sky. But at this moment, Enlightened Master Ming Zhu sneered, suddenly raised his hand, and struck He, who was already injured and leaning against a tree. Immediately, there was a frightening sound of bones breaking, and He staggered and struggled, blood spurting everywhere, and with tears in his eyes, he shouted to the sky, "Master, quickly leave." Dukan Jinren, who was about to fly, suddenly stopped. Chapter 223. In Zhengyang Hall, everything was still proceeding in an orderly manner. At least during the day, there were still many tedious but important rituals that needed to be done one by one. They couldn't be careless when paying respect to the world and ancestors. As perfected Yuanying, he was naturally more relaxed than ordinary people. Most of the time, he only needed to stand to the side and watch. He only needed to bow and pay respects during the most important activities. Dongfang Tao had been doing it very calmly without any impatience. During this time, Melaleuca Japonica took advantage of a gap when no one was paying attention to whisper to him, "Why are there fewer people than we expected from perfected Yuanying's side?" Dongfang Tao's expression didn't change as he replied softly, "Didn't I say long ago that this day isn't important? It's probably because those fellow Daoists can't be bothered to come." Melaleuca Japonica shook her head and said, "I think something's wrong. Look, even Du Kong didn't come." Dongfang Tao glanced at her and said, "It's fine if you're talking about others, but I don't believe that old man Du Kong would be at odds with Idle Month." Melaleuca Japonica thought for a moment and nodded. "You're right. Du Kong is indeed perfected sect master's loyal follower. He won't betray him. However, isn't this strange? If that's the case, why hasn't he come after so long?" Dongfang Tao said, "Something must have delayed him." Melaleuca Japonica fell silent. Dongfang Tao waited for a while and saw that she didn't say anything. Instead, he looked at her and asked softly, "What's wrong? In the past, you've always been able to see through everything in the sect. Your senses are far sharper than mine. Otherwise, I wouldn't have always listened to you. Do you feel that something's wrong today?" Melaleuca Japonica wanted to say something but hesitated. After hesitating for a moment, she whispered, "Actually, it's nothing. It looks good, but Hakushin Jinkuan released the news 2 days ago that he's coming today." Dongfang Tao was taken aback for a moment before he said, "That's right. Uncle Master Bai Chen wants to come and support his disciple, but he will definitely come at night." Melaleuca Japonica glanced at him and asked, "Then why did you come here during the day?" Dongfang Tao smiled and said, "I'm doing this to show my sincerity to the sect leader, to show my sincerity." Before he finished speaking, his expression suddenly changed, as if he had thought of something. In order to show Jinren Idle Month and Hakushin Jinkuan, who was even more powerful, he came to support the Jinren during the day. This was a kind of attitude, a very clear and unambiguous attitude. But why didn't the others think of it? In the distance, perfected Idle Month finished paying her respects to the ancestral master. She retreated to the side and looked over through the gap. Dongfang Tao raised his eyes and looked over. Both of them smiled at each other and nodded. A moment later, Perfected Idol Month looked away. The smile on Dongfang Tao's face slowly disappeared. A moment later, he said in a low voice, "It seems that something is really wrong." Boom. In the sky outside the main hall, the sound of thunder suddenly came from the gathering dark clouds. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica raised their heads and looked outside. After a moment, Melaleuca Japonica said softly, "It seems like it's going to rain again." It started raining again. The rain was not heavy. In the beginning, there were only a few drops. Slowly, it became denser. However, it was still a light drizzle that drifted down from the clouds. It made the world and the towering Kunlun mountains look a little blurry and hazy. The sound of thunder traveled into the darkness and into the shadows. Most people in this world, most of the time, felt that the darkness was scary, gloomy, terrifying, and disgusting. Very few people liked the darkness, just like how most people naturally liked the light. However, there were also very few people who liked the darkness. They felt that the darkness was also warm. They felt that the darkness was a kind of protection. When they were lonely, they would think of it. For example, the legendary evil sect. Many people in the world felt that they naturally belonged to the darkness. This was of course a misunderstanding. As long as one was human, it was hard to change one's nature. Even for the evil sect people, most of them liked the light and hated the darkness. However, the Devil sect of the Three Realms had such a long history that even the followers of the Devil sect could not remember how long it had been. Since ancient times, they had actually passed down many unimaginable and bizarre Daoist arts and divine powers. Among them, there was an extremely rare and strange skill that made one hold his breath like a dead thing. Even the heartbeat almost stopped. As long as one's cultivation was deep enough, one could avoid the senses of some powerful cultivators. But the senses were still there. Therefore, in the deepest darkness, he seemed to have seen everything. It started to rain again. The water droplets seeped into the soil. That chill was like a knife piercing into the flesh and bone marrow. He had been waiting. Waiting for the figure that should have appeared. However, the one that should have appeared did not. The one that should not have appeared, came a lot. He could not even distinguish the layers of illusions in this chaotic situation. Therefore he could only hide in the darkness and wait in silence. Dukanjinren's eyes widened in anger. He looked angrily at Mingzhu. His teeth were clenched. Mingzhu looked at him with a cold smile. He said disdainfully, "Evildoer." Du Kong looked at He who was vomiting blood. He said with grief and indignation, "You and I are both Yuanying. You have the nerve to attack such a young man?" Mingzhu sneered. "You put it nicely. If you have the guts, come and fight me for 300 rounds? Du Kong snorted. His face changed. In this treacherous situation, his many years of experience allowed him to maintain a clear mind. He said coldly, "I am not a spy from the evil sect. There is a misunderstanding. I will explain it to sect head senior brother. If you guys dare to lay your hands on my disciple, be careful that I will be ruthless in the future." After saying that, he hardened his heart. Without looking at he turned around and left. With Zhenren Yuanying's level of cultivation, it was easy to defeat him but hard to capture him. Killing him was even more difficult. The few Yuanying Zhenren looked at each other. Suddenly, Qian Deng, who had not spoken since the beginning, took a step forward. He said in a deep voice, "Are you really not a spy from the evil sect?" "Bah!" Dukan Zhenren said hatefully, "I have been in the Kunlun party for many years. Don't you know what kind of person I am? Do I look like a spy from the evil sect?" Qian Deng nodded slowly. He seemed to be moved by his words. He said in a deep voice, "Logically speaking, it is true. There must be a mistake somewhere. We also received a secret report from a spy who said that the spy from the evil sect would meet here. Dukanjinren was shocked. He quickly said, "Me too." Qian Deng frowned. "So it is. It seems that there is a mistake. Shitty, return he to Dukong Shixiang." On the other side, Ming Zhu shrugged. He picked up he and threw him toward Dukanjinren like a stone. Dukanjinren cried out in alarm. He subconsciously reached out to catch him. At the same time, he saw He's bleeding face. His heart ached. Very quickly, the sound of the wind swept past. He reached out to hold his most beloved disciple in his arms. In that split second, his body suddenly shook. His mind was suddenly in turmoil. He thought of something he had overlooked before. He learned about the evil sect spy's secret pattern from He. But where did He come from? Right, He said that he found it here. Why did Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, and the others say that they discovered the evil sect spy's secret after learning about the secret pattern? How did they find the secret pattern? At this time, he should be in the Tian Kun Peak's Zhengyang Hall. Why did he come to this secluded and uninhabited mountain forest? And Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, Guang Yang, and Mu Yuan, these four Yuanyingzhenren, also came here? Everything seemed to be a little off. His heart suddenly stopped beating, and he suddenly held his breath. A deep and frightening panic quietly attacked him, wrapping around his body. Dukanjinren didn't want to believe this cold premonition. But his reason coldly reminded him. He subconsciously loosened his grip on He. He wanted to step back, but at the same time, he saw his disciple's eyes. He's eyes were brimming with tears. He's face was filled with grief. Tears quickly flowed down. He's face was covered with tears. He's voice was hoarse. He softly called out, "Master." Dukanjinren halted his steps. He suddenly felt a chill on his lower abdomen. Boom! At that moment, in the vault of heaven, a sudden clap of thunder resounded from the dark clouds. The sound shook the surroundings, as if to tear apart the vault of heaven and earth. Accompanied by the rumbling thunder, lightning like silver snakes swam in the dark clouds. The rain suddenly became heavier and began to rush into this gray and gloomy world. The heavy rain fell on Daoist Master Dukong's face, which seemed to have suddenly aged 10 years. As a result, many deep wrinkles that no one had noticed before appeared on his face. It was only now that people realized that this person was already an old man. An old man who had reached the end of his life and was about to die. Four huge and dark figures slowly approached. They were the auras of four extremely powerful Yuanying enlightened masters. When they gathered together, their power was enough to split the mountains and split the earth. Just the invisible power seemed to have cut off any connection between this place and the outside world. Not even the slightest sound could be heard. But Dukanjinren no longer cared. He just looked at He in a daze. His mouth squirmed a few times. Then, he lowered his head to look at his lower abdomen. There was a bright blade there. It was as cold as snow. It directly cut through the incomparably tough flesh and skin of the Yuanying enlightened master like cutting a piece of paper. It went straight into the sea of qi in his lower abdomen and penetrated all the barriers. With a terrible and cruel aura, it directly pierced through the 5 elements disc in Dukanjinren's dantian. Like a demon, it ferociously nailed him to death on the blade. Then, it broke out of his body and along the way, it also cut off his spine. The blade had a handle. The handle was held in his disciple's hand. It was steady and powerful. Chapter 224. Hot blood gushed out of Dukanjinren's wound like a fountain, drenching He's palm. In the blink of an eye, his hand was completely dyed bright red. He clenched his teeth and slowly raised his head. The master and disciples' gazes met at this moment. They were so close, yet it seemed as if they were thousands of miles apart. Why? Dukan Jinren coughed. His voice was low and hoarse. At the same time, it seemed that because his dantian had been destroyed, the qi channels in his body were instantly thrown into chaos. Spiritual energy tore through his meridians, and even blood kept gushing out of his mouth. He Yi's lips trembled slightly. His eyes were slightly red and swollen. He opened his mouth a few times, but no words came out. Only the rain falling from the sky drenched his face with water droplets. The four huge shadows around him were getting closer and closer, but Dukan Jinren didn't seem to feel anything. At this moment, it was as if there was only He Yi in front of him in his eyes. He looked at He Yi, at the disciple that he had placed his life's hopes on. A bloody palm slowly rose up, trembling in the air, and touched He Yi's face. Dukan Jinren's face was filled with sadness, pain, confusion, and disappointment, but his gaze was still gentle. It was as if the person in front of him was still his most beloved disciple. He Yi's entire body trembled violently. He desperately bit his lips, trying to pretend to be strong and indifferent, but his eyes were already blurred. He couldn't tell if it was tears or rain. A hoarse voice came from his throat. He took a step forward, wanting to get close to that palm. But at this moment, a hand suddenly stretched out from behind Dukan Jinren and grabbed Dukan Jinren's bloody palm. The Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's cold face appeared beside the two of them. In that split second, He Yi's eyes suddenly widened as he saw the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's arms suddenly bend downwards. Kacha. In the heavy rain, a chill hit his face. He Yi felt as if he had fallen into an ice cellar. He blankly watched as the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master directly broke Dukan Jinren's wrist. Dukan Jinren let out a miserable howl. His entire body trembled and fell backwards. He Yi abruptly raised his head and glared at Daoist Qian Deng. Just as he was about to roar in anger, he saw Daoist Qian Deng coldly flip over Daoist Dukong's hand that was still in his grasp. Under the washing of the rainwater, a needle-shaped magical treasure that flickered with a cold light was slowly revealed in between the bloody flesh and bone fragments. The needle was not large, but it was sharp enough to kill a rebellious disciple. Thousand Lanterns of the Spiritual Master, Spiritual Master, and EU's hand. E. He Yi's face instantly turned deathly pale. He staggered a few steps back, looking as if it was very difficult for him to even stand. After saying those words, the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master suddenly let out a light shout. His eyes shone brightly and an unstoppable aura suddenly emanated from him. As if sensing something, He Yi raised his head. The other three Yuanying Spiritual Masters all had different expressions on their faces. Spiritual Master Ming Zhu's face was indifferent as if he already knew the outcome. Spiritual Master Guangyang let out a long sigh and shook his head in silence. Only Masato Kihara was startled by Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's sudden action. She wanted to say something but hesitated, but a trace of unwillingness flitted across her face. A moment later, Daoist Qian Deng abruptly struck out with his palm. At that moment, the countless raindrops in the forest were suddenly swept up by an unparalleled power, whistling in the air and forming a huge vortex. The wind and rain howled, as if the power of the heavens and earth had been injected into that palm, and it slammed down toward Daoist Qian Deng. At that moment, the palm struck Dukan Jinren's chest. There was no sound of bones breaking or flesh tearing. Under everyone's gazes, Dukan Jinren's chest instantly caved in. Having lost most of his vitality, Dukan Jinren was completely defenseless against such a powerful Yuanying Spiritual Master's attack. At that moment, his 5 viscera and 6 bowels were almost instantly crushed. Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master slowly took a step back. The whistling gradually subsided. The wind and rain seemed to have escaped from that terrifying prison with great difficulty and continued to fall aimlessly. Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master took out a handkerchief and began to slowly wipe his blood-stained palm. At the same time, he glanced at He Yi and indifferently said, "Did you see it clearly?" If you want to kill Yuanying's spiritual master again in the future, you must do this. He Yi's face was as pale as paper. He hung his head and bitterly said, "This disciple doesn't dare." Thousand Lantern's spiritual master coldly snorted and looked at He Yi with a trace of disdain in his eyes. He then turned around and walked to the side. Boom! Another clap of thunder sounded in the sky. Although it was not yet dark, Kunlun Mountain was as gloomy as dusk under the thick dark clouds. The rain was getting heavier and heavier. The cold raindrops fell from the sky and hit Dukanjinren's old and bloodless face. Everything around him seemed to suddenly be very far away. At that moment, he seemed to suddenly think of many things. From childhood to adulthood, from birth to death, how had he lived his life? Had he regretted it? Had he felt gratitude? Had he felt pain? Had he felt joy? However, everything seemed to suddenly become abnormally light and was replaced by an incomparably heavy fatigue. Exhaustion drowned him like a tide, bringing darkness with it as it swept over. Finally, his body could not hold on any longer. The body that was once tall and proud in the world, with a powerful cultivation, finally lost all its vitality on this day and fell down dejectedly. With a thud, he fell heavily on the dirty ground. Black mud splashed on his face, rotten leaves jumped up and down in front of his eyes, which were still open. In his final moments in this life, he had never imagined that he would meet death in such a manner. The heavy rain hit his body, and the coldness spread. His body twitched, and then gradually stiffened. He was about to die. He was about to die. Everyone could see it, including Dukanjinren himself. He waited for the final moment in pain and sorrow. However, at this moment, his eyes, which had fallen into the dirty mud on the ground, suddenly saw that just a few inches in front of him, under the rotten leaves that had just been shaken up, there was a seemingly unremarkable tree branch stuck in the mud. He saw that tree branch. That tree branch seemed to have sensed him. The wind and rain roared, sweeping away the darkness and filth of this world. However, in that moment of death, Dukanjinren's pair of absent-minded eyes suddenly had a strange luster. He seemed to be startled. But very quickly, the corners of his mouth slowly rose into a strange smile. At that moment, the sky full of wind and rain and the surrounding tall trees, including those even more terrifying figures, seemed to have disappeared from his eyes. In Dukanjinren's eyes, there was only that small tree branch left. There was black mud on the ground. The ice-cold rain continuously poured down, washing over their bodies. Perhaps sometimes, the gap between the living and the dead was only a thin layer of mud. He felt it, he seemed to understand something. He seemed to want to speak but couldn't. He laughed. His head tilted, and then he died with that trace of a strange smile. Boom! A sudden clap of thunder rang out. Everyone raised their heads to look at the sky, only to see lightning flashing across the sky like snakes. In the dirty underground, the tree branch also trembled slightly, before slowly hiding under another piece of rotten, withered leaf. Everything, as if it had never happened. When the clap of thunder exploded, on the Tian-Kun peak of Kunlun, in the Jianghu Hall, the grand meeting of the sects was halfway through, and now it still had to continue with a grand and lively atmosphere. Su Qingjun stood in the crowd, feeling a little uneasy. Today's weather was a little abnormal. The thunder rumbled, and at the same time as the meeting of the sects was going on, it always made people feel a little uncomfortable. In fact, it was obvious that Su Qingjun was not the only one who felt this way. Among the many Kunlun disciples standing in the Jianghu Hall, many of them would steal a few glances at the sky outside the hall. Of course, no one had ever said that the heavens did not allow thunder and rain during the meeting of the sections. In order to understand the power of creation and stealing from the heavens, most of the time it was still important to take advantage of the situation. The saying that man can conquer nature, in the many years of history of cultivation, had long been proven to be meaningless. In front of the true power of heaven and earth, all things in the world were perhaps ants. Therefore, they still did what they had to do, even if it was thunder and rain. At least, on the high platform of the Zhengyang Hall, the head of Kunlun, Idle Month, always had a calm expression. Her deep self-restraint could be seen clearly, and she had a bearing that would not change even if the heavens and earth collapsed in front of her. It was really admirable. Taking advantage of the short break in the middle, Su Qingjun walked to the side of Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica, and greeted the two of them. Melaleuca Japonica seemed to really like Su Qingjun. She smiled and pulled her up, saying, "There are many eyes here, you don't have to be so polite." Su Qingjun agreed, and then said a few more words to them. However, these two were old and experienced cultivators, and very quickly, they could tell that Su Qingjun did not mean what she said. Melaleuca Japonica smiled and asked, "What's wrong, June girl? If you have something to ask, just say it." A trace of embarrassment flashed across Su Qingjun's face, but after a while, she still gathered her courage and said to Dongfang Tao, "Martial Uncle Dongfang, I want to ask, yesterday you said that the power of heaven and earth might affect Sumo's recovery, but this, such a powerful thunderstorm, does it count?" Dongfang Tao laughed and shook his head. Melaleuca Japonica also sighed softly, and said with a smile, "You are confused because you are too concerned. Don't worry, how can this degree of power count as the power of heaven and earth? It's fine." Su Qingjun nodded, looking as if she was relieved, but also a little embarrassed. Dongfang Tao said, "After tonight, it should be fine." Melaleuca Japonica said, "And there's also Xin watching." Su Qingjun made a sound of acknowledgement, and said, "I've really troubled younger sister Xin." Chapter 225. The rain continued to pour, and occasionally, lightning flashed across the dark sky. Thunder rumbled above the clouds. Atsu was already drenched, its black fur stuck to its body, and its broken body was covered with wounds and blood. It was not far from the mountain peak, but the ferocious demon beasts behind it were getting more and more irritable. There were constantly demon beasts driven by their natural greed pouncing on it, wanting to drink its blood and eat its flesh. Atsu's response was to bite them to death. Its sharp fangs were as sharp as blades, and it was as cruel as a demon. It was a beast that was more ferocious than these beasts, and whoever dared to stand in its way would fight to the death. It was a battle of life and death, and in this stormy day, there seemed to be no end to it. The rain drenched the black dog's body, and it felt a little cold, and a little lonely. At that moment, it suddenly missed Lu Chen, and remembered the many nights when it slept quietly on the same bed with him. Perhaps, that was the most peaceful and happy moment of its life? Roar! A deep and mournful roar burst out from Atu's throat. He bit down on the throat of a demon beast that lunged at him in the wind and rain. He tore its flesh, swallowed its blood, and then threw the dead body to the side. The auras in the distance seemed to stop for a moment, and Atsu looked back in disdain, and then continued to walk towards the peak, panting. This day was so long. Even it did not know if it could make it through. Would he be able to see the rising of the bright moon in that cloudy and rainy weather? In the dense forest, someone said this. Let's wait until the sky turns dark. That's when we have important things to do, and at the same time, let's see if anyone will come." The people around had no objections, so they walked to a secluded corner, sat down quietly, and waited. Waiting for nightfall. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica were waiting for the end of this ceremony, waiting for the important small meeting that would take place in the evening. Su Qingjun was also waiting for the end of this grand ceremony so that she could go back to visit her younger brother Sumo as soon as possible. Perhaps, if she could make it in time, Sister Xin would be able to find that man to come see her. In the guest room of the flowing fragrance garden, Xin was sprawled on the table in boredom, staring at the continuous rain outside the window in a daze, as if she had lost her mind. At the same time, White Lotus had already descended from the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky. She walked towards the front of Kunlun Mountain with a relaxed expression. Behind her, the strange mountain that was floating in mid-air was also covered with a layer of gray. The sky had unknowingly darkened. Rain poured down from the sky, enveloping the entire vast Kunlun mountain range, as if the entire world had become hazy. However, on the winter peak, there was not even a drop of rain. It was unknown whether it was because there was a powerful prohibition that isolated the rain outside, or because the rain fell in, but the overly cold wind and snow on the winter peak had condensed the rain into ice and snow. On the lonely and quiet winter peak, other than the violent wind and snow on the highest peak, Zhuoxian seemed to be the only person left on the entire mountain. He stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing down. For many years, he had stood at this place, gazing at the majestic Kunlun mountain, and was especially familiar with the undulating mountains of Kunlun. He could even tell where the majestic Tianquan peak was at a glance, and he could also imagine how lively and bustling it was at this moment. For many years, at this time, he would be in the Zhengyang Hall on Tianquan Peak, rejoicing for the sect, cheering for his senior brother, and being proud of his sect. However, he had never thought about himself in the slightest. Zhuoxian lowered his eyes slightly, and after a moment, he turned around and walked towards his cave abode. The wind and snow outside were isolated, and he took out the wind speech plate, placed it on the table, and opened it. The sound of wind and snow was immediately heard, and after a moment, Hakushin Jinkuan's voice came from this strange magic treasure. "What's the matter?" Zhuoxian showed a respectful expression, bowed, and said, "Master, you're going to watch over eldest senior brother's place tonight. May I know when you're going to leave?" Hakushin Jinkuan's voice said, "What time is it now?" "It's already afternoon, and it'll be dusk in 2 hours, so I wanted to come and ask if you have any arrangements." Hakushin Jinkuan paused for a moment, and then said, "There's no other arrangements, just do as we originally agreed. I'll come down in 2 hours." Zhuoxian cupped his fists and bowed, and said respectfully, "Yes, I'll wait here for master." On the wind speech plate, the wind and snow disappeared, and gradually, it returned to its original unremarkable appearance. Zhuoxian straightened his body, and his face was slightly pale, as if he was in a daze, thinking about something. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew from behind, and there was a slight chill on the back of his neck. Zhuoxian's body tensed up, and he suddenly turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" At the entrance of his cave abode, the stone door had silently opened, and after a moment, an unusually tall and burly figure appeared at the entrance of his cave abode. The dark shadow then surged into his cave abode, and completely covered him. Zhuoxian took a step back, and his expression suddenly showed some nervousness, but then he took a deep breath, and his body slowly relaxed. "You've come?" he asked in a low voice, and for some reason, there seemed to be a little bitterness in his tone. "Yes." The huge figure responded, and after a while, the person suddenly asked again, "Do you regret it?" The expression on Zhuoxian's face changed, and he did not answer immediately. The huge figure also seemed to be unusually patient, and did not impatiently interrogate him, but quietly waited outside the cave abode. After a while, Zhuoxian said, "There's nothing to regret." "Oh." The tall figure outside the cave abode responded, and then, suddenly, a white light flashed, and something was thrown in from outside the cave. Zhuoxian stretched out his hand to grab it, and when he looked at it, he found that it was a jade bottle in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, and still opened the bottle cap to take a look. He saw that there were no pills in the jade bottle, and it was filled with black water. But for some reason, the black water did not have a fishy smell, but faintly carried a strange fragrance. Like the fragrance of ambergris. Zhuoxian's hands suddenly trembled, and his pair of eyes stared fixedly at the jade bottle. Both of his hands clenched tightly, as if he was 1,000, 10,000 times afraid that he would accidentally drop the jade bottle. "I think, you know what to do, right?" Zhuoxian slightly lowered his head, and after a while, he softly said, "Yes, I know." In the depths of the damp mountain forest, the 4 Yuanying spiritual masters and the only one, Jin Dan Friar, had been waiting. However, the so-called traitor did not appear, and there was no trace of anyone approaching in the surroundings. No one spoke, and in the heavy rain, everyone waited until the sky was about to turn dark. Somewhere in the distance, there seemed to be a lively scene of gongs and drums, and celestial music floating in the air. It was not too clear, but on this day, the Yuanying spiritual masters had seen the liveliness of Tianquan Peak. Xian Deng and Ming Zhu looked into the distance with ridicule on their faces. He, on the other hand, was sitting on the ground in a daze. Occasionally, he would glance at Daoist Du Kong's corpse, which was still lying on the ground. Then, he would immediately look away with a trace of guilt and a trace of pain in his eyes. "Aren't we going to participate in the sect council tonight?" At this time, the one who suddenly spoke was Masato Kihara, his brows slightly wrinkled. "Waiting here for half a day without anyone coming, there's no need to continue waiting." He wanted to say something, but stopped on second thought. Except for him, everyone present was a powerful and profound Yuanying spiritual master, so there was indeed no room for him to speak. Xian Deng next to him looked over, saying, "In any case, there is indeed a devil sect secret pattern that was first engraved here. Let's not do anything else, just treat it as a matter of convenience. Let's wait for the sky to turn dark. If there really is a devil sect traitor coming, we will capture him. If the current situation has already alerted the enemy and he doesn't dare to come, then there's no harm, we just need to carry on with our business as agreed." Masato Kihara nodded slowly, saying, "Okay, I understand." The cloud board clattered, the bell and drum sounded in unison. In Tianquan Peak's Xingyang Hall, the tedious but solemn and lively ceremony was finally nearing completion. Many people had a trace of exhaustion on their faces, but Perfected Idol Month, who was standing on the high platform, was calm and did not seem to be tired at all. When the people at the side saw this, they naturally felt that Perfected Idol Month was indeed an amazing Yuanying spiritual master. He actually did not look tired at all after hosting the meeting for such a long time. But what should come will come. These ceremonies were completed one by one, and at the last moment, Perfected Idol Month took a break from the busy work and took a look outside of Xingyang Hall. The sky outside was still drizzling, the lightning in the sky continued to pass through the clouds, and the thunder was like the roar of the heavens, causing large amounts of rain to pour down. The sky seemed to be darkening bit by bit. This day seemed to be over. But it also seemed like it was about to start. In the depths of the dense forest, the few Yuanying spiritual masters who had been resting with their eyes closed were abnormally calm and serene, giving people the impression that something earth-shattering was about to happen. Only when the sky slowly darkened and the night was about to envelop, Perfected Thousand Lanterns suddenly opened his eyes, looked up, and slowly stood up, saying, "It's about time, let's go." "Where to?" someone asked. "Tianquan Peak, Xingyang Hall." Perfected Thousand Lantern faintly said, his eyes staring into the distance, his face expressionless as he walked away. The other three perfected Yuanying spiritual masters and he also followed behind him. Following their departure, the forest quickly quieted down. On that dark land, next to Dukan Jinren's corpse, a hollow branch slowly moved, as if it wanted to rise, but after a moment, it suddenly sank back down and stayed in the same place, motionless. The sky darkened, and darkness descended on Kunlun Mountain. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled in the sky, like a noisy banquet was slowly opening its curtains at this time. Chapter 226. At dusk, the grand and lively meeting finally ended. Everyone worshipped their ancestors and prayed that everything would go smoothly in the coming year. They thanked the ancestors of the Kunlun party for their blessings, allowing the Kunlun lineage to survive for thousands of years without being cut off. It was still thriving today. However, the weather that day seemed to be particularly bad. The rain outside was getting heavier, and the rumbling of thunder was incessant. Although it was only dusk, the sky was already as dark as night. Countless candles had already been lit in the huge Xingyang Hall. Otherwise, there would only be darkness left. Fortunately, the people gathered here today were all accomplished cultivators. One after another, they began to leave in an orderly manner. Only now did Immortal Idle Month let out a sigh of relief. Although it was very glorious to be the sect leader, it was indeed not an easy task to preside over the meeting for a day. He looked around with a calm expression. After a while, it would be the highlight of the day. Almost all the elites of the Kunlun sect would gather here. Although there were a few troublemakers who were not well behaved and said strange things all day long, as long as his master arrived and took charge of the meeting, everyone would naturally be obedient and there would be no more objections. This was the power of a soul formation perfected cultivator. Immortal Idle Month smiled slightly. He turned around and walked down the high platform, walking towards the back of Zhengyang Hall. In the crowd, Su Qingjun said goodbye to Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica and followed the crowd out of the hall. As for Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica, they also had to part ways here. Only Immortal Yuanying could participate in the small gathering at night. Of course, the location of the gathering would not be in such a spacious Zhengyang Hall, but in a side hall at the back of the hall. Many Kunlun disciples were leaving from the main entrance in an orderly manner. The queue was very long. Su Qingjun stood at the back of the queue and waited. Occasionally, she would look back and see Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica chatting for a while. It seemed that Melaleuca Japonica gave him a few words. After Dongfang Tao nodded in agreement, he also walked towards the door that Immortal Idle Month had left through. With him were a few other Yuanying perfected cultivators who had already arrived. Their destination was naturally the same. When they saw each other, they also smiled and nodded, including Dongfang Tao. Perhaps because he had arrived in the daytime, the expressions of those Yuanying perfected cultivators were very gentle and friendly when they saw him. They probably thought that he was also on their side. After a while, Su Qingjun walked out of Zhengyang Hall. She had just stepped out of the tall main entrance of the hall when she stepped out of the hall. The sky had actually turned completely dark. Even the drizzle that was falling from the sky could not be seen clearly from a place that was slightly further away. The cold wind blew, and the cold rain fell on her face. There was a trace of coldness that seeped into her skin. And in a place further away, the wind and rain were hurried. The night was bleak and hazy. Even the figures of those towering mountains could not be seen. Boom! Just at this moment, above the dark clouds in the sky, a sudden clap of thunder sounded. A bolt of lightning pierced through the darkness of the vault of heaven. It was like a twisted silver snake that divided the entire sky into two halves. With the help of the lightning, Su Qingjun saw the sky full of wind and rain sweeping over. The human figures were walking briskly in the dim light of the night. Most of the people were trying to leave this place, but with the help of that bright light, it reflected a group of people who suddenly walked in the opposite direction. There were a total of 4 people. The Kunlun disciples who were near them were almost all startled. They bowed continuously. The person in the lead was the head of Baichao Tang, Immortal Qian Deng. Following behind him were Ming Zhu, Guangyang, and Mu Yuan, the 3 Immortal Qian Deng. With 4 people gathered together, naturally, the momentum was extraordinary. Along the way, no one dared to block their way, and they smoothly walked over. Su Qingjun was a little surprised, but she still hurried forward to greet her master, Masato Kihara. At the same time, she also greeted the other 3 Immortal Qian Deng. Masato Kihara's expression was indifferent. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he said, "Have you also stayed here for the whole day?" Su Qingjun said, "Yes, disciple has been here all along." Masato Kihara nodded and said, "Now there's nothing else. You can go back and rest first." Su Qingjun replied with an, "Oh," and took a step back. Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she suddenly saw Immortal Ming Zhu, who was originally walking in front of Masato Kihara, suddenly turn around. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he called out, "Wait." Su Qingjun and Masato Kihara looked at Immortal Mingzhu at the same time. Masato Kihara frowned and said, "Senior brother Mingzhu, what do you mean?" Immortal Mingzhu said, "Senior brother Mu Yuan, after we go in, we also lack someone to order around. If there's anything that needs to be reported, it'll be troublesome without someone to pass the message. I was wondering if I could trouble your disciple to wait here for a while?" As he spoke, there was a smile on his face. He looked amiable, but Masato Kihara's pupils shrank slightly. After a moment, he said in a deep voice, "It's enough for me to be here. There's no need for Qingjun to come here." "There's no need." Immortal Mingzhu smiled and said, "Just in case." As he said this, he looked up at Masato Kihara and said with a smile, "What's wrong? Senior brother Mu Yuan doesn't seem to be willing." Masato Kihara gritted his teeth. When he was about to say something, he suddenly saw Immortal Mingzhu, who was originally walking in front, suddenly look back with a cold expression. Masato Kihara was shocked and swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth. The atmosphere outside the hall suddenly became a little stiff. Su Qingjun was a little puzzled, but she could still feel the subtle atmosphere. She hurriedly said to Masato Kihara, "Master, it doesn't matter if I stay here a little longer." Masato Kihara's eyes turned cold, while Immortal Mingzhu laughed and said, "You're really a good disciple who respects her master." "Not bad indeed." Immortal Mingzhu's expression also eased a little. Then he walked forward in silence and went directly into the Zhengyang Hall. The others also followed him in. Masato Kihara's expression changed. He slowly walked to Su Qingjun's side. After a moment of silence, he said to her, "Since you've promised the two immortals, stand guard outside the door. Remember, don't worry about anything else. Just stand there." Su Qingjun was a little surprised and said, "I know. But master, what happened? Why do I feel that you look a little strange?" Masato Kihara smiled bitterly and said to himself in a low voice, "They are still a little worried about me. What did you say?" Su Qingjun didn't hear clearly and asked. Masato Kihara shook her head and said, "Nothing. But since you've promised Master Mingzhu, then stand here for a while. But remember two things. First, no matter what happens, don't enter the hall, especially the rear hall. That's where the Yuanying immortals gather. Do you understand?" Su Qingjun nodded and said, "Of course, we're not allowed to go to that important place." Spiritual Master Muyuan smiled, then lowered his voice and said, "Also, you should wait here for an hour at most. After an hour, when it's almost dark, you can leave by yourself. You don't have to stay too long." Su Qingjun was a little surprised. She looked up at Masato Kihara and saw Masato Kihara smiling and saying, "Don't worry, I'll tell them later. It's not a big deal." Su Qingjun was actually still worried about her brother Sumo, who was still in the guest room of Liuxian Garden. She didn't insist and said, "All right, disciple will obey." At this time, a call came from the front. Masato Kihara glanced at the hall in front of him and said, "Then I'll go. Be careful." Su Qingjun watched Masato Kihara walk into Zhengyang Hall. He walked further and further away until he walked into the darkness behind the candlelight, until his figure could no longer be seen. At this moment, the dense forest was already pitch black. Other than the torrential downpour, it was like a cold and deathly silent world. The body of Dukan Jinren, who had died not long ago, had been taken away by Qian Deng and the others. So at this moment, the open space in the forest was empty. There was only dirty water, dirty black mud, and soil mixed with mud and rotten leaves. This forest was unusually quiet and dark. Only the occasional flash of light from the lightning and thunder in the sky could illuminate the scene under the trees for a moment. The cold rain seeped through the soil, making the dark soil feel like an ice cave. The branch hidden under the withered leaves shook a few times in the rain, like a dormant worm about to wake up. Lu Chen, of course, hadn't lost his sober mind. The scene that happened not long ago, that soul-stirring scene, seemed to be unfolding in front of his eyes. Especially when he stabbed Dukhan Jinren's lower abdomen. Lu Chen, who was hiding under the ground, received a great shock at that moment. That scene was so familiar. That knife seemed to have awakened the memory that had been sealed for many years. In that instant, he returned to that terrible night many years ago. Even with his calm and perseverance, his breathing was slightly disordered at that moment. Then, when Dukhan Jinren fell on the muddy ground before his death, Dukhan Jinren discovered that he was lurking here. Lu Chen didn't know what Dukhan Jinren was feeling at the last moment of his death. He also didn't know why Dukhan Jinren didn't shout out his whereabouts. Perhaps he just deeply hated those who killed him, or perhaps he wanted to frame them. Perhaps he was the spy of the devil cult, who had discovered his companions but refused to sell them out. Or perhaps, he was simply at death's door and had no strength to shout out. This sudden massacre, the disaster that arose from the wall made one's heart turn cold. But in the end, Lu Chen discovered that he was still unable to see clearly who was the evil cult spy who had concealed himself the most. And more importantly, he discovered that the person who had promised him to appear, until now, had still not appeared. Perhaps, he should leave now? He pondered silently in the darkness, but at this moment, suddenly, amidst the sound of wind and rain, in this frighteningly cold and dark forest, from one of the gloomy paths in the forest, came a new sound of footsteps. That foot stepped on a small puddle, splashing a bit of water. Then, silently and noiselessly, it continued to approach Lu Chen in the darkness, walking over. The wind and rain became more and more urgent. Chapter 227. The sky darkened. The rumbling of thunder resounded throughout the world, and the frenzied lightning tore through the sky, as if an angry god was roaring in the sky, illuminating the dark Kunlun mountain. Light and shadow intertwined. The light was only for a moment, but the dark shadow seemed to be everywhere, and would continue like this forever. The entire gigantic Kunlun mountain flickered in the storm, lightning, and thunder, except for one place. That was between the clouds and the sky. The four strange peaks floating in the sky were majestic and motionless, and in the mysterious forbidden area below them, the thick fog that never dissipated all year round was not affected by the storm at all. All the raindrops fell silently into the thick fog, and there was no longer any movement. The thick fog did not show any signs of shrinking or retreating. Sometimes, this strange thick fog even slowly expanded outwards, slowly drifting towards the four strange peaks in the sky. This was the most deserted and empty day of the year in the most important sacred place of the Kunlun party. Because unless they were in closed-door training or could not come out for other reasons, most of the Yuanying Jinren who cultivated between the clouds and the sky would go to Xingyang Hall of Tiankuan Peak. As for the remaining two deity transformation stage Jinren Tianlan, he rarely came back, and Hakushin Jinkuan had also left Winter Peak on this day a few years ago to support Jinren Idle Month. The wind and rain were mournful, and the fog was misty. It seemed that no one was paying attention to this place anymore. Only the thick fog kept drifting in the air, looking at the dark night sky. Among the four mystical peaks of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the Winter Peak had always been a very peculiar peak. On this torrential night, the other three peaks were drenched by the rain, but the Winter Peak was the only one that didn't have any rain. Because it was too cold on this peak, almost all the raindrops would immediately turn into frost when they fell, and then turn into wind and snow that slowly drifted down. In the world of wind and snow, it was cold and lonely. Transparent icicles of different shapes could be seen everywhere, reflecting each other with a beautiful and psychedelic luster, as if it was a fairyland that was completely different from the outside world. This place was so beautiful, but there was no one around. It seemed like a place where no one should live. Hakushin Jinkuan's Immortal's cave was located at the peak of Winter Peak surrounded by a violent snowstorm. Legend has it that once a deity transformation stage true monarch, a supreme great cultivator, all of them would possess peerless divine abilities that could penetrate the heavens and the earth, countless marvelous Daoist techniques, and innumerable magical treasures and spirit materials. Furthermore, they would meticulously set up a magical immortal's cave that belonged only to them. Inside, there were all kinds of mystical things, countless formations, the gathering of countless essence from the world, and all kinds of unimaginably fierce restrictive mechanisms. There was even a saying in the cultivation world: never challenge a living soul formation perfected monarch in a perfected monarch's cave abode, even if you were a soul formation perfected monarch. Only dead perfected monarchs of divine transformation realm would have their cave abodes loosened after a long time, allowing outsiders to spy on them. In the long history of the divine central continent, every ancient perfected monarch's cave abode was an inconceivably huge treasure trove. Just a word or two about it was enough to drive the world crazy. Even so, the ancient perfected monarch's cave abodes that had been passed down from ancient times were still extremely dangerous places. Over the years, they had claimed the lives of countless explorers who yearned for treasure. Wuxia Xianxia stood quietly outside the cave abode on Winter Peak. The wind and snow drifted past and landed on his shoulders, but he seemed to be unaware of it. High above his head was the perfected monarch's cave abode that was wrapped in a violent snowstorm. Occasionally, he would raise his head in the cold wind and glance at the mysterious abode high above. But even with his current Jin Dan realm eyesight, he was unable to see through the snowstorm, so he couldn't see the appearance of the abode clearly. He had never been to the top of the Winter Peak, and he had never seen the cave mansion before. He had always had a wish in his heart. He wanted to take a look at his master's cave abode, to see for himself whether the cave abode of the most powerful cultivator in the world was really as magical and powerful as the legend said. But, after so many years, he still didn't have this opportunity. But it didn't matter. Wuxia Xianxia had always been a very patient person. He could wait, and he was willing to wait. Just like now, he was waiting for his master Hakushin Jinkuan to come down from the abode high above. Even if the cold wind hit his face and the ice and snow froze him, he didn't care in the slightest. On the snowy ground beside him, there was a large wooden chest. Sometimes he would glance at it, and then he would look away. The night was deep, and the wind and snow drifted. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the vault of heaven. In an instant, the sky was filled with wind and snow, swirling up into the air. They gathered at one point and then suddenly dispersed, like a celestial maiden scattering flowers. In the wind and snow, a figure floated down. His appearance was haggard, and his eyes were full of spirit. It was Hakushin Jinkuan. Wuxia Xianxia deeply lowered his head. With a respectful expression, he bowed and said, "Sherzuan." Hakushin Jinkuan stood with his hands clasped behind his back. With an indifferent expression, he said, "Change your clothes." Wuxia Xianxia responded. He turned around and opened the chest beside him. A gust of cold wind blew past, revealing a set of solemn and dignified formal attire in the chest. For many years, wearing formal attire had always been the privilege of the sect leader during the sect council. And as the master of Immortal Idol Month, as long as Hakushin Jinkuan sat there solemnly in this set of attire, there was no need for any words to explain everything. Just as Wuxia Xianxia bent over and was about to pick up the formal attire for his master to wear, he suddenly heard Hakushin Jinkuan's question coming from behind him. "Are you the only one on this mountain?" Wuxia Xianxia's body suddenly stiffened. His fingers that had just touched the soft formal attire only felt an endless chill suddenly rushing into his body from his fingers, freezing the blood in his entire body. He even subconsciously held his breath. It was pitch black outside the window. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, and heavy rain poured down, making people a little flustered. Sitting in front of the window, Xin felt a little uneasy. At this time, a light sound suddenly came from the bed behind her, startling her and causing her to quickly look back. She saw that Sumo, who was lying on the bed, was still unconscious. She just turned over and muttered something, but her expression was actually a little frightened, as if she was dreaming of something terrible. Xin relaxed, but she immediately felt a little funny. Although she was also born in an aristocratic family in Kunwa City, she wasn't familiar with the other members of the Su family except for Su Qingjun, whom she had become close to these days. As for Sumo, she was usually a tyrant in Kunwa City, so she always kept a respectful distance from her. Speaking of today, it was the first time she was alone in a room with this person. She didn't know why, but she always felt a little strange. Therefore, when she saw Sumo turning over in her sleep in fright, Xian didn't go forward to comfort her. At this time, a thought suddenly flashed through her mind. If the person lying on that bed right now was Brother Lu, what would she do? Would she go over and take care of him? Maybe, she would. She giggled and suddenly felt her face become a little hot, so she became a little shy and complained in a low voice. It was unknown whether she was talking about herself or cursing Lu Chen. But after standing like this for a while, she still opened the door and walked out. Just like that, she stood in the corridor outside the room. A gust of cold wind mixed with raindrops blew over, blowing against her face. She took a deep breath and suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. Originally, on such a dark day, a girl alone in a room with a strange man didn't look right, so it was better to just stand outside the door. Xian smiled as she looked at the rainy night. The surrounding houses were still deserted, and the people who went to Heavenly Kun Peak still hadn't returned. On the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky, Zhuoxian slightly bent his body. His fingers touched the dress. In this cold and snowy night, for some reason, a drop of sweat suddenly dripped down his forehead. It was also at this time that the old man standing behind him in the wind and snow said very indifferently, "Where's that girl White Lotus? Where did she go?" Zhuoxian closed his eyes and opened them again. In that instant, he took a deep breath and everything returned to normal in the blink of an eye. The smile returned to his face. He reached out and picked up the dress from the big box, spread it out in his hands, and respectfully carried it towards Hakushin Jinkuan. At the same time, he said with a smile, "Little junior sister went down the mountain earlier." Hakushin Jinkuan snorted and said, "What's she doing down the mountain instead of cultivating on the mountain? Naughty and mischievous." Zhuoxian walked to Hakushin Jinkuan's side, lifted the two sleeves of the dress with both hands, and helped Hakushin Jinkuan put it on slowly. At the same time, he said with a smile, "Although little junior sister's talent is outstanding and rare, she is still a child after all. Sometimes, it's not a big deal to play around a little." After Hakushin Jinkuan put on the dress, he let Zhuoxian button up those gorgeous but also very complicated buttons in front of him. At the same time, he frowned and said to him, "You and Idle Month are both her senior brothers. When I'm not around, you should also strictly control White Lotus and not let her loose." Zhuoxian nodded and said, "Yes, I understand." As they spoke, the dress was put on. Hakushin Jinkuan shook his sleeves slightly, and the two snowflakes beside him turned into a whirlpool. Then, they quietly dispersed and slowly floated down. "Let's go. We'll help your senior brother to hold the fort one last time," Hakushin Jinkuan said lightly, and then his gaze drifted to the distance. In the distance, there was a misty wind and snow, and wisps of mist were floating in the air. "It's very foggy tonight." He sighed and walked forward. However, he had only taken a few steps when his body suddenly stopped. There was silence on Winter Peak. It seemed that even the snowflakes were falling silently, and the whole world was desolate and cold. He slowly turned around and looked in the direction he was just now. The thick mist lingered in the wind and snow, but it did not dissipate. Unknowingly, the mist at the bottom of the four strange peaks had spread to the top of Winter Peak. At the same time, at the edge of the wind and snow and the mist, there was a sudden ripple in the mist. An unusually tall and burly figure appeared indistinctly in the mist. Chapter 228. The wind and snow whistled over, but when they reached the edge of the thick fog, they suddenly disappeared. The tall figure in the fog began to walk forward, out of the thick fog, and into the wind and snow. The wide sleeves of the robe, the tall stature, and the eye-catching and famous bald head clearly indicated who this person who had suddenly stepped into the Kunlun holy land between the sky and the clouds was. When Hakushin Jinkuan first saw the tall and burly figure, his body trembled slightly. Then, his pupils shrank as he watched the man walk out of the fog. The wind and snow drifted down, but they couldn't get close to his body. Even the night seemed to be a little further away from him. Then, he heard the bald man greet him with a smile. "Hello, senior brother." There was only one person in this world who was qualified to call Hakushin Jinkuan senior brother. That person was also a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator named Tianlan. The initial surprise on Hakushin Jinkuan's face slowly faded, and his expression gradually calmed down. At this time, he even smiled slightly and nodded. "What a rare guest, junior brother." With his hands behind his back, Tianlan casually walked forward. The falling snow silently melted and disappeared a few feet away from him, and there was not the slightest trace of footprints in the snow under his feet. If he hadn't seen this divine transformation stage perfected cultivator in front of him, he might really have thought that he didn't seem to be on Winter Peak. At this moment, this uninvited guest was looking around with some emotion. He looked at the strange snowy peak and said, "Isn't that so? I've never been to Winter Peak before. Actually, let me tell you, senior brother. Back when Master was still here, I wanted to come to Winter Peak to play. In the end, it dragged on until now. I actually haven't come here for so many years." A gloomy look flashed across Bai Chen's face. It was as if Tianlan's words had pierced some unpleasant memory in his heart. He frowned slightly. But very quickly, his gaze moved past Tianlan and landed on the back of the tall figure. On the other side was the mist that Tianlan had just walked out of. It was thick and deep, and at the same time, it could be clearly seen that the thick mist was still slowly rolling and drifting, slowly dispersing on this winter peak. Tianlan turned his head and looked at Hakushin Jinkuan, saying, "Why, senior brother, don't you welcome me?" Bai Chen indifferently said, "Aren't you here whether I welcome you or not? What does it matter?" Tianlan laughed and clapped his hands. "You're right." Bai Chen pondered for a moment before she turned her gaze slightly and looked to the other side. On this mountain peak, apart from the two strongest rulers in Kunlun Mountain, there was a third person. Zhuo. From the beginning, this second disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan had been standing at the side without saying a word. At this moment, when Hakushin Jinkuan looked over, Zhuo's face revealed a look of panic as if he wanted to say something to him. Hakushin Jinkuan wanted to say something but hesitated. Then, he shook his head slightly and sighed. Although Zhuo's dharma was powerful, it was clearly a little difficult for Jin Dan Friar to face a soul formation perfected lord and ask his senses to detect the other party's traces. Hence, he waved his hand slightly at Zhuo, signaling him to step aside. Then, he turned to face Tianlan. His expression became serious as he looked at his powerful and terrifying junior brother. "All right, tell me, what do you want to do by coming here today?" Tianlan smiled. His expression was gentle, and he even reached out to touch his bald head, looking a little embarrassed. He said to perfected Lord Bai Chen with a smile, "Senior brother, back then, Master told me that he wanted to give this winter peak to me, and I really like this place very much. That's why I wanted to say this today. Why don't you give this winter peak to me?" He said with a smile. Tiankuan Peak, at the back of Zhengyang Hall. Immortal Idol Month, who was still wearing a formal and solemn gown, sat in the side hall of the back hall, looking very dignified. At this moment, people were coming to the side hall one after another. Those who could come here were, of course, the highly respected Yuanying Immortal of the Kunlun party. 2 rows of big chairs were lined up, but there were 2 main seats in the middle. Immortal Idol Month sat on one of them, and slightly behind him, there was another empty big chair, but at this moment, no one was sitting on it. Those who came would often look at the empty chair, and then return to their seats with a complicated expression, remaining silent. Dongfang Tao's seat was the last chair on the right side of this side hall. After coming in and greeting Immortal Idle Month, he sat here. At this moment, his expression also looked a little complicated. Occasionally, he would look up at Immortal Idle Month, and then quickly his eyes fell on several immortal Yuanying immortals sitting on the other side. They were led by Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, and the others. Unlike the others who were scattered, Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, Guangyang, and the others were clearly gathered together. But the most surprising thing was the fourth person walking behind Qian Deng and the others. He was Masato Kihara, and also the leader of the Iron Branch of the Kunlun Party. In many cases, Masato Kihara's attitude was equal to the attitude of the only 4 Yuanying immortals in the Iron Branch. When he saw Muyuan Jinren, who had been living a detached life away from worldly affairs, suddenly walk over and sit down in front of Thousand Lanterns Jinren, Idle Moon Jinren's face turned ugly for the first time. After a while, seeing that the number of people in this side hall was quite large, roughly more than 10 people, Qian Deng stood up and said to Immortal Idle Month, "Sect Master, I think there are enough people, should we start?" Immortal Idle Month snorted, but coldly said, "There are still a few people who haven't come yet, let's wait for a while." Qian Deng did not refute, only nodded, and after responding, he sat back down again. At that moment, almost all of the Yuanying immortals in this side hall had their eyes on the chair behind Immortal Idle Month. Why hasn't he come yet? Of course, Immortal Idle Month could also feel the strange expressions of the Yuanying immortals, but his expression did not change in the slightest, as if he had a well-thought-out plan. He only smiled faintly. On the contrary, Thousand Lanterns Mingyue and the others wore solemn expressions as they waited quietly. Outside the Zhengyang Hall, Su Qingjun stood quietly. At this time, many of the disciples who participated in the daytime meeting had almost all left, and even the original Daoist children in the Zhengyang Hall, probably because the night was too dark and there was too much wind and rain, so no one appeared here. Unconsciously, Su Qingjun found that in the large space in front of the Zhengyang Hall, she was the only one left. The night was mournful and cold, and the wind and rain were still falling without any signs of stopping. There was no one around, and the sky was also dark. Only a faint candlelight from the Zhengyang Hall illuminated a small area. Su Qingjun looked at the sky, and for a moment, she could not tell the time, but she felt that it was about half an hour, but there was no movement in the Zhengyang Hall. After pondering for a while, she still decided to wait a little longer. At this moment, she suddenly heard a sound of footsteps coming from the wind and rain in front of her. Su Qingjun looked up, only to see that the sky was too dark, and in the cold wind and rain, it was difficult to see clearly. She could only vaguely see the vague figure of a man, slowly walking over. Her heart suddenly felt a little nervous, and she reached behind her, holding the scabbard of the long sword. That figure gradually walked closer, all the way to the front of the hall, and then walked up the steps. Su Qingjun was suddenly startled, because she knew this person. It was He. Different from the handsome and elegant appearance of the past, at this moment, He walking in the wind and rain didn't look quite right, his face seemed to have a trace of deep exhaustion and his clothes were somewhat messy. Of course, walking in the rain without an umbrella, it was normal to suffer a little. Under the eaves in front of the hall, the man and the woman looked at each other, each with a bit of vigilance, but after a moment, He was the first to speak, and greeted Su Qingjun. "Junior sister Su." He faintly called out to her. Su Qingjun nodded, and said, "It's so late, senior brother you still came here, is there something?" Her attitude was not stiff, but her tone was still a bit cold, as if she still remembered Sumo's injury. He asked, "Aren't you also here?" Su Qingjun said, "I want to wait for my master Masato Kihara." "Senior brother are you also waiting for that Dukanjinren?" After saying that, she thought for a moment, and said, "Oh yes, I don't think I saw him this afternoon." He smiled, and said, "Yes, my master is always elusive, so I'd better wait for him here. Saying that, he looked around, and then, unexpectedly unafraid of the wet and dirty, directly sat on the stone steps not far from him. One must know, the previous storm was so strong, and the stone steps had long been wet. Su Qingjun frowned, and took 2 steps to the side, as if intentionally or unintentionally distancing herself from He. Some words, no one said it out, but they could all feel the alienation and a trace of hostility in each other's eyes. Just like that, not knowing how long, He suddenly opened his mouth, and said, "This night is so windy and rainy, when exactly will the sun rise?" Su Qingjun looked at him, her expression indifferent, and replied, "It's still early." He smiled bitterly, turned his head to look at the dark night sky full of wind and rain, and was lost in thought. Even if the rain dripped on his body, he didn't care. Su Qingjun snorted, after struggling in her heart for a few times. Finally her face sank, and walked forward, directly into the wind and rain, and then left Shenyang Hall. You're tuning in to the Unparalleled SwordWill YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.